Hey everyone, thanks so much for stopping by. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy.
When Charlotte Katakuri unexpectedly becomes a parent, he never imagines his new son's life will turn dangerous so quickly. After Luffy is attacked and turned into a young vampire, Katakuri is forced to protect him not just from enemies, but from a world that would fear what he's become. Despite the challenges, Katakuri commits himself fully to raising Luffy with patience, structure, and genuine care. Luffy, however, refuses to let his circumstances dim his spirit, remaining a cheerful, affectionate ball of sunshine who easily wins hearts wherever he goes. Through quiet bonding moments, protective instincts, and soft domestic scenes, the story focuses on found family, healing, and unconditional love. With minimal angst and overwhelming warmth, parenting. The Right Way delivers a wholesome, comforting look at what it means to be a good parent, no matter the odds.
Chapter 6, Stress and Sadness. The next morning, he confidently strode into the busy mall. Katakuri didn't think Luffy would run off anymore, but he said he felt safer this way. He was technically kidnapped when he wasn't connected to him, after all. Coerced away from his father and then bitten by a vampire. He saw Luffy's face grow tense, and he swallowed, but he didn't attack, didn't show any inkling that he thought people smelled yummy and their blood would be tasty. He more looked like he was constipated or his stomach hurt. While that woman frustrated him, she helped Luffy by distracting him in a way he didn't see himself being able to do. She helped both of them out, which Katakuri thought was the complete opposite of her disrespectful episode. He felt pity for that baby and hoped for his sake that she grew up. Provoking people with unknown quirks was stupid, and Katakuri never understood people who risked themselves when it wasn't worth the effort in the first place. Who knows whose quirks weren't in control, or reacted to anger. It just was safer and smarter to try and be civil with everyone you could be. Luffy got a small cup of pretzel bits, and ate them there. But Katakuri saw mid-bite that his fangs grew longer when a young woman walked by. He shut his eyes and mouth tightly, and Katakuri picked him up and removed him from the situation. Once she was out of scent range, Luffy let out a sigh. You okay? She smelled good, and eating made it feel worse. Then why don't we not eat around crowds? Just to be extra careful. Luffy nodded, and finished his pretzel bits. He was sitting on Katakuri's shoulders, using his head as a resting spot for his little paper cup. The boy was much higher than everyone else on Katakuri's shoulders, so he could easily see everyone around. He suddenly pat Katakuri's head, and quietly said, "There's a bad man over there." It wasn't the best to point in that direction, but he lowered his arm quickly after Katakuri looked in that direction. What do you hear? He says about a bomb, Luffy hissed in panic. Katakuri didn't hesitate to call the authorities, and an alarm started going off for everyone to evacuate the building. Luffy was good to be on his shoulders so he wasn't squished in the crowd of panicked humans. Luffy pressed his hand to his nose to try and plug the smell. They got out quickly, and ran to the parking lot. Cop cars and heroes arrived at the scene. But Katakuri didn't need to direct them as there was an explosion inside the mall that was so strong half of the other side of the building collapsed. People were getting in their cars and booking it. Luffy was crying, and he took him off his shoulders to hold close. Luffy could have just saved hundreds of lives. They stayed on the sidewalk outside of the parking lot, which was empty of normal vehicles. They had to give their story and couldn't just run off. Once they saw a big person wrangled into a armored vehicle, Katakuri asked if it was safe. If the bad guy was gone. MMHMM. Now they are wondering what happened, Luffy said, standing next to Katakuri, who was sitting on the curb so Luffy could hug him but also stand. They walked back to the mall, which was void of customers or employees. Excuse us, I'm the person that called about the bomb. Officers walked over, and Luffy was hugging his father's leg. They all smelled like sweat and gunpowder, which made them not smell tasty at all. What happened? How did you know about the bomb? He was asked. My son has exceptional hearing and heard the man speaking about it. The officers looked down at Luffy, and they obviously could tell he had vampirism. What's your name? Luffy, he said quietly. Well, Luffy, you could have just saved hundreds of lives. That's quite the useful quirk, they praised. Luffy said it wasn't a quirk, it just came when he was a vampire. He was blunt and honest. I see. Well, it sure was helpful regardless. Great job, kid. The officer went to the nearest cop car and got a sticker with a badge on it. Your badge of honor for the day. Thank you, Luffy. He took the sticker and beamed brightly. MMHMM. He said happily, and admired the sticker. Katakuri asked if they needed to be questioned further, but they were told they didn't. So, it was time to go home. He could tell Luffy was holding back a meltdown. It had been scary. So they walked to the car, and when Luffy was clipped in, he did start crying. "You did great, Luffy. You were very brave. Too many people in one place." He cried. "It smelled too strong. And then it exploded. But nobody got hurt. You didn't hurt anyone, and nobody died from the bomb. And you got a fancy sticker. That shows they saw you as very helpful and were very grateful. You did a wonderful thing. You acted like a hero." Luffy said heroes were bad. "Why would you think that?" The man asked, startled, having no idea why he'd think such a thing. "See, 'cause you aren't a hero, you changed your mind. And Dragon was a bad man and he was a hero." Katakuri smiled at him. "Just because I changed my mind about being a hero doesn't mean they're bad. I left because I found something I'd like to do more, not because I thought heroes were bad. And not everyone is like Dragon is. He's a good hero, but not a necessarily good man. Heroes are definitely not evil. They help a lot of people every day," he explained patiently. Luffy's stomach rumbled, and he said he was hungry and thirsty, not replying to his father's words, distracted again. Katakuri gave him a granola bar and then one of the smaller pouches of blood. He ate and drank, and then sighed deeply. "That was scary, Papa. The boom was so loud it hurt my head. Then it's a good thing we were far away, isn't it? And it is scary, but thank you for trusting your ears and telling me about it." Luffy nodded, and said he was sleepy. "Take a nap, I'll bring us home. We can watch some movies, how about that?" But Luffy was already asleep, snoozing in his car seat quietly. "God, what a day. Whoa, that's awesome," Zoro said brightly when Luffy was at his house on a play date. Zoro had the most awesome puzzles, so they were working on one of the big ones. "Man, I probably could have heard, too. I wonder what they thought of a vampire savant, the day. It was scary, but the police were nice. Nicer than that mean lady with the baby. But, hey, you can go in public now, right? Could you start school?" Zoro asked, switching subjects. Luffy said he didn't know. People very close to him all smelled very strong. And he even had his body react to the smell of a passerby. She had smelled so yummy. He hadn't thought about attacking or anything, but was very startled when his teeth changed. He was just glad Papa had saved the day and got him away. He poked his upper left fang, and said, "You're not allowed to get bigger again." To it angrily. Zoro snickered, and Luffy asked how his transformations were coming along. He said he'd been practicing his goal to use his werewolf side to his advantage. Zoro looked away and then down. "It didn't go good. The full moon was last week, and afterwards, I tried to stay as a wolf for as long as I could. I suddenly went blind and deaf. But then everything was back, but I was a human again." Luffy gasped. How scary. But at least he was better now. "Yeah, it was pretty scary. I still have that goal, but I'm gonna not work on it for a while. It was too scary. But I'll figure it out someday," he finished with conviction and confidence. "How'd it feel getting called a hero?" Well, I thought heroes were bad before. So being called that didn't feel very good. But then Papa explained about heroes and that they aren't all bad. I like the little sticker they gave me, though," he said happily. He'd had the badge laminated so he had one on every outfit. It was fun, and Papa took a lot of pictures with him wearing it. He and Zoro finished the puzzle after 2 hours. It was a really big one. They were both listening to music, on the deck in the backyard. Zoro's old pet dog had come over to watch and sleep next to them. "Do you scare him when you turn into a wolf? He stays inside during the night. But get this, the cops were called on us. It was a full moon, and you know how damn noisy I am. Well, they called the police on my screaming and a whole SWAT team came. It was scary, but I wasn't bothered, and Dad talked to them about the noises. They left, but Dad said they felt really sorry for disturbing us. So, pity points, I guess." Luffy felt bad for him, but they both knew what it felt like to be infected by someone else and to suffer the effects of that selfish act for the remainder of their lives. Their lives had barely started before they were unfortunately targeted. But neither had ever been approached by the ones who turned them into a vampire and werewolf. Which was a relief. They were scary. He was spending the night there, a double sleepover. Katakuri had to take care of some financial things at the bank which would take a while, so it was a good day for Luffy to go to his friend's house. They watched movies with popcorn, unbuttered since Luffy wasn't allowed to eat unhealthy foods and snacks. Not only because he wanted him to be healthy, but sometimes he got an upset stomach when something that shouldn't go into his body interacted with some blood types. So he was fine with better food. Zoro's dad was inspired by Katakuri's diligence to keep Luffy healthy with a good diet and did the same for Zoro and Kuina. Though she moved out and escaped it just barely. Zoro already got plenty of exercise, so he was very healthy, like Luffy.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
"Let's watch a scary movie," Zoro said. "No, I don't want to watch a scary movie. And Papa would be mad." "Well, we could try. And you wouldn't need to tell Katakuri. I'm not a good liar, though." Zoro knew that was fact, and so they watched an action movie instead, and then went to bed on Zoro's bunk bed in the room he shared with his sister when he was a toddler. It was a fun time, and Luffy didn't even think to tell his dad about Zoro's sneaky plan. He was just happy that there was a treat in the car for him. AB negative. He cheered, able to smell it easily through the container. I managed to get a whole carton for you. Luffy cheered, and clipped himself into the car seat, and hummed happily as he sucked down the yummy blood. It was warmed, too. It had been left on the dashboard for the long drive back to Zoro's house, which was in the middle of nowhere, and so it warmed by that. I love you, Papa, Luffy said, satisfied and belly full. I love you too, Luffy, Katakuri said with a smile. Are you tired? No, I'm not tired. He was soaked in sunscreen right now, but he was completely used to that smell being present any time he went outside. In the bounce house, it smelled of fresh sunscreen at all times since he always went in right after lathering in the helpful substance. Good. There's a surprise visit today. Luffy was excited, not knowing who it was, but knowing his papa wouldn't bring anyone over that Luffy didn't want to see. So they got home, and there were a few cars in front of the house. Luffy was a social butterfly, so he was fine going from a sleepover straight to visitors at home. He loved people. Nice people, of course. Who didn't smell too yummy? He smelled it with smoothie, cracker and brulee. He didn't see them much because they lived a ways away from Katakuri's home. Luffy ran inside and hugged the first one he saw, who was Brulee. It's been too long, Luffy. She said brightly. Yeah, I missed everyone. He'd seen them all a handful times, with Oven being the one to visit the most since he lived fairly near and was very close with Katakuri. But what are ya doing here? We heard about your saving the day at the mall and wanted to hear all about it from you. Luffy liked what he did being praised, and told them the events, starting from going into the mall and being okay around the people, to his yummy pretzel bits and then the bad man talking and the evacuation. He accidentally mentioned that he didn't think everyone were yummy smelling, but none of them looked overly surprised and just smiled at the obviously good news. Smoothie did her special treat for him. She could squeeze juice out of anything she twisted. It was impractical to use most times, but sometimes her juice tasted good. So for Luffy, she wrung out a blood pouch, and blood juice came out, which tasted really good. Even if too much made him feel sick. It wasn't unhealthy, and was like an expensive dessert. He happily drank the juice through his favorite cup that had a straw built in against the side. They had dinner, which was homemade pizza. It was one of Luffy's favorites so he could have blood-soaked pepperoni, which he could, of course, not order from the pizza places. It made a stinky smell to the others in the oven, but to Luffy, it smelled like heaven. He was getting a lot of yummy things today. Katakuri was used to the smell, and worked on Luffy's pizza last so no blood risked getting in the others' food. They talked around the dinner table, and Luffy enjoyed being around his family. All of them were nice but for one. Cracker didn't like him much. Luffy didn't know why. So far, he was the only kid out of all of the siblings. But he was just always worse than a grumpy grump. His papa didn't have him over anymore when he upset Luffy once. The family members played a board game before Luffy got sleepy, and they left for the night. What a good day he had. I don't wanna leave. Luffy cried in the car seat. Karina was in her carrier beside him, clipped into the seat with the seat belt. I don't want to either, but we have to put our safety above the house, Katakuri said in understanding. It was downpouring, and their house was in the flood danger zone. They had to leave it and make it to higher ground and Zoro's house was open. So they offered for Luffy and Katakuri to go over. Kobe's home was in danger, too, but their grandparents had opened theirs to give them a safe space. Katakuri really didn't want to lose his home, but it could always be rebuilt. A house wasn't nearly as important as their health and safety. He disliked the rain pounding on the car because it was making Luffy scared. For him, each slam of a raindrop sounded like a gunshot. He was crying, but it was expected. They had to leave their home that might get damaged. Of course he was upset, and Katakuri wouldn't get irritated at all with it. They had packed some clothes, Luffy's favorite toys, photo albums, and the computer, along with any medications they might need if the house did go down. Lots of blood in a big cooler, as well. The boy did eventually fall asleep despite the noise. When they got inland more, there was danger of mudslides, but it wasn't as dangerous on the back road there took to Zoro's home. When they got there, it was still raining, and they went inside. Zoro and Kushiro helped them bring their things inside. Katakuri thanked them for letting them stay. He had to hunch a bit because the ceiling wasn't high enough for him to stand comfortably. But he was fine, and had to do this in many places over his lifetime. Luffy was still crying, and Zoro was trying to comfort him, and brought him to his room to watch some funny videos. Katakuri had his phone in his hand for any updates. He truly hoped their home wouldn't be destroyed. Sure, he could afford to repair damages, even if there was a lot, but having the house rebuilt would take a long time. The news alert came up a few hours later, and Katakuri's face fell and heart plummeted. Their neighborhood was underwater. He didn't know how to tell Luffy. He hunched over and put his head in his hands. I'm so sorry, Katakuri-san, Kushiro said sincerely. The taller man sighed, and said the home could be rebuilt. He'd paid off the mortgage and had homeowner's insurance. He didn't tell Luffy that night, and he slept on the couch, which was long enough to fit him. Luffy slept in the bunk with Zoro until he wandered out in the middle of the night and climbed onto Katakuri's chest, moving the blanket to cover both of them. The father didn't make a move or show he woke up from the boy climbing on top of him when he went back to sleep. In the morning, when Luffy asked if the house was okay, Katakuri had to tell him eventually, and said the truth. Their home had been flooded up to the roof. Luffy immediately started to sob and wail at the table. His papa walked over and knelt to hug the poor kid. Katakuri was keeping composed, even though he was very upset, too. But both of them were alright, and that's what mattered most. At least we can get new furniture, and better kitchen appliances, Katakuri said, trying anything to cheer him up, or at least stop the heartbreaking sobs. The Fuchsia home had survived, and not been flooded. He was glad for that. Luffy cried himself sleepy again, and took a long nap. This was a devastating loss. But it could be rebuilt, and their belongings replaced. Karina was locked in the spare bedroom to keep her away from the dog, and so they had her safe. It was good she wasn't an outdoor cat, so they were able to get her when they needed to leave. Their little family unit was whole. That was what mattered most. Luffy would be upset for a while, but hopefully it would be better once they started rebuilding. And they'd keep the exact same floor plan. Same everything they could. When Luffy woke up, he wanted to go outside, and the deck was not wet like the rest of the large property. Muddy in some places. He put on all his sunscreen, and it was evening. But when he went out, he cried and ran back in, his skin burnt red. Even though it was late, and he had sunscreen on, he got bad sunburns. In just a few seconds. His friend and father were very worried, and Katakuri suspected it was the stress he was feeling, the sadness overwhelming him. He stayed in his papa's lap, hugging his broad chest, sniffling and in pain. It healed fairly quickly, but that didn't mean it wasn't scary or hadn't happened. Zoro was standing by the window in worry and concern, and then hurried around the house and closed the curtains or blinds for all the windows and doors. "Are you okay, Luffy?" Zoro asked. Katakuri rubbed a hand down his clothed back, which hadn't burnt him, protecting his skin. Luffy shook his head but didn't speak. The taller child hurried to the cooler on the kitchen table and got a blood pouch out and brought it to him. Luffy smelled the blood, and took the pouch. He was still very sad and upset as he sniffled and drank at the same time. When the bottle was empty, Katakuri coated it in a thin layer of mochi so it was like in a sealed bag. It was tossed in the trash bin outside. Luffy eventually fell asleep, maybe unable to handle it anymore. Losing his home and then being burnt by the evening sun. For dinner, they ordered pizza, the only place that delivered to them all the way out there. It was quiet, but Zoro kept trying to cheer Luffy up, who moped at his personal-size pizza. He didn't like non-homemade pizza, it seemed. He wasn't impressed by the grease all over it, and tried drying it with a napkin. But when the cheese was still coated in oil, he used a fork to separate the toppings from the bread, and just ate the bread with the tomato sauce still on it. Zoro's food wasn't that regulated, his father didn't make pizza from scratch, so he did seem Luffy's attitude was strange. Usually when he went to their home, he brought the food or a normal meal was made. Never anything bad for them. Katakuri was glad Luffy was a picky eater when it came to food standards. After growing up with a horrendous diet, full of sugar and carbs, as that's all their mother really fed them, he wanted his kid to eat very healthy but still enjoy good food. So, yummy food that was not bad for you. His whole family respected that and didn't tempt or give Luffy unhealthy foods. They spent the night there again, and in the morning, Katakuri started to make arrangements to have their home rebuilt as soon as it was safe and possible. But he was also thinking that this could happen again. Maybe they should move somewhere else. So, after breakfast, he took Luffy to the couch, and asked him about it. "I wanna go home. Home isn't there right now. And it might happen again. We could find another plot of land, and have our same home built, but in a safer area," Katakuri said patiently. Luffy didn't want this to happen again, so he decided he was okay to have their home made the same, but just in a different place. Katakuri had lived in that home for over 10 years, so it did hurt to have it gone for good. But he was thinking of the future by building a home somewhere safer. Didn't want either of them to go through this again. When evening rolled around, a day full of calls made by Katakuri and a lot of researching on his laptop, Luffy wanted to try and go outside. Katakuri went with him. He'd take Luffy back inside if it went bad. But Luffy didn't want to be stuck inside all the time like a normal vampire who had to be covered from the sun at all times. He had a stern face, a pout and furrowed brows present as well, and then stepped out into the sunlight. The sky wasn't as bright blue anymore, and started to dim as it got later. Luffy was fine, and the sun didn't hurt. "I guess I have to be happy now," he mumbled. Katakuri pat Luffy's head. "We'll figure it out. You shouldn't force yourself to be happy all the time. If you're sad for now, stay inside. Until things are more stable," he said. He didn't want Luffy to lie to himself and ignore and try to suppress any negative feelings. That just wasn't healthy for anyone, let alone a developing child. Luffy hugged his legs, and then they went inside. Katakuri offered to make food that night, and cooked for the four of them. "Papa," Luffy screeched, holding his broken arm. Katakuri hurried over, and looked furious at the construction worker who said nothing of him climbing the scaffolding. He got out his phone to call an ambulance, and picked up his son carefully. They were currently on the new property. There was a little shack on the yard for them to sleep in at night while the house was being built. While he waited for help, he was holding Luffy loosely, rocking him back and forth while he cried. It was when the paramedics came that Luffy said his arm didn't hurt anymore. He pulled away and squirmed to be set down instead of using his words, and stretched out his broken arm. There wasn't a trace that it was hurt. But he was still upset, since it had been painful. He should come anyways. Just to be safe, the paramedics said patiently. Luffy slumped his shoulders, hating hospitals and doctor houses, and Katakuri said he would drive him there. Luffy shuffled, and apologized to the paramedics for taking their time. "It's nice to hear you're better, though. We don't enjoy helping hurt people, we like them being healthy. That's why we do our best to get them the care as fast as we can." Luffy smiled in relief that they weren't mad at him. He got into the car, and Katakuri already planned to no longer let Luffy be out of his sight while on the site of their new home. It had been a few weeks since the flood, and they sold their previous property for a good sum of money. The new house was nearly the exact same floor plan, but Luffy had wanted it to be 2 stories. That was unnecessary, and there were only 2 of them there. So he compromised and had one playroom that would be upstairs. So it technically was a 2-story home. Luffy was just fine with this, and looked forward to a playroom, already having chosen what furniture he wanted from a catalog online. They were completely mismatched in color and style, but it was a young child's playroom, it didn't matter much. He could have a red couch with a gross yellow-colored table if he wanted. When they got to the doctor's, which Luffy didn't want to go into, and got cranky and defiant, Katakuri managed to convince him to see if he could amaze the doctor. They probably wouldn't be there long, after all. Being patient with him and letting him take his time to decide yielded preferable reactions, and he agreed to go inside. But since it was a hospital, he had a nose plug. There would be the smells of blood for him, and that smell upset him because it made him hungry. He'd never attacked anyone even when he was very thirsty, so Katakuri trusted him. They explained to the receptionist that his wound was better, but they wanted to make sure he was fine. "And he's a vampire?" she asked dismissively. "He has vampirism, yes," Katakuri said back. Irate inside but still respectful and calm outwardly. She said they could leave. If he was all healed, there was no point in taking up space and time. Luffy was pouting and looking at his feet, of course hearing all of this. That's a bit disappointing, to turn a child away from getting checked up over a broken bone after falling from construction scaffolding. Her face turned red, and now everyone in hearing range were looking at her critically. So, they were seen. She glowered at them the whole time they waited. Some looked at Luffy curiously, clearly trying to be discreet. Katakuri was intimidating in size, and his resting bitch face also could put off many strangers. The young vampire didn't notice, and was playing a puzzle game on Katakuri's phone, very focused on that. When they were called in, Luffy dropped the phone, and it hit the ground with a loud noise, but it didn't crack, and Luffy was extremely relieved it was fine, and happily handed it to Katakuri. He said nothing of it, and they walked further inside. When they got to the room to be checked on, the doctor asked what happened, and where he was hurt. "I got better, but the ambulance man said to come anyways," Luffy explained in his simple voice. "I see. Do you want to tell me what happened?" she asked politely. Luffy said he'd been playing on the scaffolding but then fell and broke his arm. But it healed maybe 10 minutes later. "Well, that's a trait that all people with vampirism have. Healing quickly is a main advantage of it," she explained. "There's no swelling or bruising, and the limb doesn't hurt. I think you're in the all clear. Maybe be more careful, though." Katakuri took this as meant for him, and he nodded to her, though Luffy also promised to not play stupid again. Summed it up pretty well. They got a smoothie, and headed back to the house. Luffy repeated his promise, but Katakuri would still be supervising him whenever he knew he should. But it was a relief hearing that Luffy could heal from broken bones. The burns faded quickly, too, and he hadn't been hurt by the sun again. Katakuri really thought it had to do with his mental state at the time. Stressed and upset people were more likely to suffer illnesses. It just made sense, though he had called around about it and got no good answers. Which was annoying, but they were careful and used multiple layers of sunblock, to the boy's extreme distaste from the scent, which he got used to in moderation. Too much put him off from going outside at all. Chapter 7, Blood Problems. "Kobe, I have a playroom, now." Luffy cheered when his friend came out of Makino's car. He ran to Luffy and they hugged, and then both 5-year-olds ran into their new home and upstairs to play in Luffy's new room. All of his toys were stored in there, because that was where toys belonged, in Luffy's opinion. Luffy heard Katakuri greet Makino before she drove away. So Kobe would be spending time with them, today. They played with the plethora of toys and various coloring books. After playing on the rug that had streets on it with their toy cars, he ran downstairs and asked Papa if they could play hide and seek. Kobe was all for this, and the boys ran in different directions to hide from the large man. Luffy stuffed himself under the sink, squished into a tiny ball while he heard Kobe hide behind the curtains. They were thick and closed right now, so there was a lot of space to hide behind them. Luffy held his breath when he heard Katakuri announce he was done counting. He took his time finding them, and found Kobe first. No, the 5-year-old complained about being found first. How about we both look for Luffy? Katakuri offered. So they looked for him and then Kobe opened the cupboard. Found you. Kobe cheered. I won, though, Luffy mumbled, needing help to go out due to how he'd maneuvered his body. Getting dislodged, he flopped out onto the wood floor with an oof. Kobe asked if he was okay, and Luffy nodded. Then they got up and got some snacks from the fridge. On the shelf they could reach had all the snacks. Yogurts and other snacks. Katakuri went to the couch, staying in the same room while they ate. They talked about random things while eating the yogurt. It wasn't healthy Greek yogurt because that made Luffy feel sick. So this was the most sugary snack they had. Kobe went to put the spoon in the dishwasher when he slipped on his loose sock and face planted. He hit his nose hard, and it was bleeding. Kobe. Luffy cried when he saw before the sudden smell of blood hit him. Papa. Kobe's hurt. Luffy cried, trying to plug his nose as the other boy cried, his face hurting. Katakuri hurried to Kobe and helped him up, getting him a napkin for his nose. The father inspected it, and said it hadn't been broken. But the blood didn't stop, and Luffy's tummy rumbled. It happened before now, but this was the first time it happened to his family or friends. Well, besides when he bit Zoro back in the rehab. When Kobe stood up, Luffy backed away a step. What's wrong? Kobe asked, still sniffling and pinching his nose shut. Katakuri was on the phone, telling Makino. But he was also standing in between them in case Luffy had something happen. The black-haired boy looked down. It smells yummy, he admitted in shame. Oh, it's not your fault, though, Kobe replied, even if he looked a bit uncomfortable. Once the blood stopped, his face was wiped up. He wanted to go home, not in the mood to play anymore. While they waited, Luffy went to the trash can with the spoiled napkin in it, and felt like a robot as he dug it out, and smelled it deeply. It smelled good, but Kobe wandered in for water while waiting, and saw what Luffy was doing. What? Luffy looked up, his pupils blown wide. There was the source of the yummy blood. His teeth elongated against his will, and he leaned forward before his feet were covered in mochi and stuck him to the floor. Kobe looked frightened. Why don't we go outside to wait for your mommy? Katakuri asked, his voice soft and kind, trying to calm the situation. The other boy nodded and fled the kitchen. Once he was gone, Luffy fell to his knees, the mochi stretching just slightly, and started to cry. He really felt like a monster. We should started feeding you more often. On a schedule, not just when you're thirsty, Katakuri said kindly on the couch. Luffy was face down on the beanbag chair across from him, feeling ashamed and embarrassed. He'd heard Kobe crying about Luffy scaring him when Makino arrived at the house. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. I know. I should have not thrown the napkin away and not made it enclosed and sealed off. Luffy got frustrated at this. It was his fault for going to smell it. He could have just left it alone. Though it wasn't the best thing to happen, it was just your vampire instinct. Attracted to blood, and there was some fresh, warm blood. Like an addict, you were responsible, but so is your body. Luffy was glad Katakuri agreed it was a problem he made, too. They couldn't just blame anything besides Luffy for something he did bad. Will you put me in timeout? Do you want to be in timeout? No, I want a nap. Then go take a nap, Katakuri replied. I'll clean up the kitchen so there's no lingering scent. Luffy smiled at him and hugged his legs before he hurried into his room to sleep. Katakuri leaned into the couch and sighed. He didn't know how Luffy would have acted if he hadn't put the mochi down. He was surprised he dug the napkin out of the trash, though. Well, he wasn't actually exposed to fresh blood from people. Katakuri's body was made of mochi and so he couldn't bleed easily. There had been no accidents at home, so this was the first time someone in the house had spilled blood. He really wasn't ready for school. If a kid scraped their knee in front of him, that could be bad. The father felt so sad for Luffy. There was no way he wanted to act like that. He did his best to plug up the smell, but in the end, he still reacted badly. It probably was very frightening to Kobe. He was only 5, had just gotten hurt, and had his vampire friend look at him like he was, frankly, tasty. And his fangs elongated, which was a problem, as it was very noticeable to others when it happened. So when Luffy was asleep, Katakuri called Makino's phone. There was no answer until he hung up. She called back only a few minutes after. Hey, Makino-san, I assume Kobe told you about what happened. Yes, he did. Is Luffy safe? If there's a supervisor, I feel there would be no problem. He just had a bit of trouble with the smell of fresh blood. He was open with her, not going to sugarcoat or lie. He feels very bad over it, and would like to talk to Kobe later. She was silent for a bit, and Katakuri frowned deeply. Is there any way for him to not be attracted to blood? If something happens again and you're not there, Katakuri wasn't liking that she was acting as if Luffy was a ticking time bomb. But either one of them was always in the house near them when they played together. But it looked like he had to maybe stay at the foot of the stairs to Luffy's playroom. It had no door so he'd easily hear what was going on inside. He knows what he did wasn't right and feels very sorry about it. We're planning on making sure he drinks a lot before going anywhere or anyone coming over. Do you know when he'll be fully safe? Makino, he's 5 and has had this less than a year. It may take quite some time for him to find a happy medium at all times, Katakuri said in a flat voice. He hated where this was going. In her shoes as a parent, he understood why she would feel this way. Seeming hesitant over the friendship dynamics. She'd been with an emotionally and physically abusive man who harmed her child frequently. Of course she'd be very protective, just like Katakuri was for Luffy for very different reasons. Well, I don't think it's safe to leave them alone together. At least she wasn't saying at all. They could just work for Luffy to gain full trust again. Then one of us will always be in the room with them, Katakuri replied. We both have quirks that could physically separate them, he added. She could control her ice enough to put a barrier up between them if something did go catastrophically wrong. How does Kobe feel about this? Makino sighed. He's sad. He feels degraded, kind of like he's just a snack. I've tried to reason with him. It really shook him, to be honest. He may need some time, and to talk to Luffy. Over the phone or video chat, she explained. Katakuri's face fell further, and he listened, and could hear Luffy still snoring, thank goodness. He could be able to hear both sides of this sad phone call. I'll have Luffy talk tomorrow, then, Katakuri replied. Tell Kobe that Luffy was very upset about what happened after he left. I will. And I'll call you tomorrow. Try to catch Kobe at his peak positiveness. Thank you for helping him, today. The call ended, and Katakuri let out a deep, long sigh. Luffy was still sleeping, which he was glad of. He felt so sorry for him. But if Kobe didn't want to be friends anymore, Luffy had Zoro. But Kobe was Luffy's first friend, so losing him might be very hard. Would probably be very upsetting. He didn't look forward to such a future. When Luffy woke up, he asked if Kobe called. I called them. Tomorrow you'll talk to Kobe on the phone or video. His mommy doesn't feel like leaving the house tomorrow to bring him. This was a fib. It could be true, but it was never said. Oh, okay. I hope he feels better soon about it, Luffy said brightly. Katakuri smiled, hiding his sorrow at the way things could turn on the phone call. I'm hungry. We're having leftovers from last night. It had been a pasta dish, and Luffy cheered, more than happy with this. His dad hoped he didn't lose his bright smile. The next morning, Luffy was bouncing on the trampoline since the flood destroyed his bounce house he got for his birthday. This trampoline had a second one under it and firm netting. Maybe it was overboard, since it wasn't inherently dangerous and Luffy could heal cuts and broken bones. But he wanted to minimize the risk as best as he could. Katakuri was gardening, having just finished the virtual therapy session with the poor girl with leukemia. Luffy was very good about not being noisy and staying out of trouble while he was working. He could hear anything if he tried, but he never had interest or a reason to do such a thing. Despite his enhanced senses, he rarely used them for personal gain. When the phone rang, Makino's ringtone, they both froze for a moment, and Luffy stopped jumping, looking nervous. Remember to be honest but careful with your words, Katakuri said. Luffy nodded, and they went back inside. It was afternoon, so the sun didn't hurt Luffy. He had to have sunscreen on to be on the trampoline since it wasn't covered from above like his bounce house. Katakuri answered the phone, and opened the window to see Makino sitting with Kobe, who looked sad, and his lips were turned down deeply. He looked tired and upset. Luffy didn't speak first, looking worried and uncomfortable. He was sitting in his father's lap like Kobe was for his mother. Hello, Luffy, Katakuri. Good afternoon. How are you feeling, Kobe? Does your nose still hurt? No, it doesn't hurt anymore. That's a relief. He nodded, and nothing was said for an uncomfortable moment. Luffy spoke, and said he was sorry that he looked bad. He didn't mean to, it was an accident. Kobe was silent, and Luffy started to pout and worry. Makino encouraged Kobe to talk and say how he felt. It scared me. I'm sorry, Luffy replied. You gonna hurt me? Kobe asked, making the topic 100 times heavier. Luffy shook his head vehemently. But your papa had to stop you, he pointed out. It was scary. Luffy's face turned red, and he started to cry, and apologize over and over. He begged for Kobe to still be his friend. It was heartbreaking to watch, and Katakuri rubbed Luffy's back to try and help him calm down. Luffy will be drinking more before you come over. In case anything happens again. Makino was frowning and patting Kobe's head, too. But Kobe didn't agree, and was crying too, hiding his eyes. It was a difficult sight, as they were always smiling and laughing. And here they were, crying at one another. Luffy was shaking in his sobs, probably couldn't focus on what was being said anymore. I wanna stay friends. Don't you, T2? Luffy cried, looking at the screen again. It scared me. I don't wanna be scared. Kobe cried back. The call was getting out of control right now, and Katakuri shared a look with Makino through the phone. It was best to end the conversation for now so both of them could calm down. She offered to call them back in a few minutes so they can calm down. That sounds like a good idea, Katakuri agreed, and the call was over. Luffy started to really wail and screech about not wanting to be a monster. Katakuri shushed him, assuring him that he wasn't a monster. He was just different, but not a bad different. It's not bad to be strong and fast, and you won't get hurt easily, either. Plus, you have super senses. Even drinking blood doesn't make you a monster. You're only a monster if you do monstrous things. You haven't. What if I did? Then you would make what you did wrong right. Try to fix things when they're fixable. He said he didn't want to see Kobe again until he was better and safe. We don't know when that will be, Katakuri said, touching his cheek. Are you sure? You might not see him for a while if you want to do that, he added patiently. Why don't we sit on it for a bit? Luffy nodded, knowing he might lose his friend for a while. But he said he'd rather lose a friend than scare them when they were around him. It was a surprisingly mature thing to say and think. But it also was in the moment. They waited and then Makino called back. Luffy was ready to give his proposal of a break so he could get better and prove he was not a monster, but Kobe sobbed out that he never wanted to be scared like that again. Luffy nodded, and said he would make himself better. We could take a break, and I'll get better. Then you won't be scared, he insisted. Kobe agreed to this, and Makino suggested they have short calls on the phone. They didn't need to ignore one another to have space. Luffy will work with Katakuri on bettering himself, and you can still be friends. Luffy nodded, near tears, and Kobe agreed. It felt they dodged a huge bullet. And also made a very adult decision. We'll talk again soon, Luffy, Makino said with a smile. The call ended, and Luffy started to cry, but then gave a determined look before Katakuri could say anything of comfort. I'll get better, he declared. Katakuri was glad he and Kobe would still talk on the phone, since Luffy would probably make little progress in the near future. No matter how damn hard he tried, this was something that would be very difficult for anyone, regardless of age. But at least Luffy had Zoro. Zoro wasn't good at making friends. He was treated nastily because his class found out about his disorder. Some parent had said something about it and then their kid spread it all around. Luffy worried that would happen to him, too. He was much more noticeable than Zoro was. When he was at Zoro's house, playing in the small above-ground pool that had been installed, he explained about his situation with Kobe. What a crappy friend. Hey, he got scared, he's not a bad friend, Luffy said firmly. Zoro sighed, and apologized for being rude. Why did you say that? Maybe I'm jealous. What? Why? Luffy asked in surprise, forgiving Zoro for his words once he apologized. The green-haired boy said Luffy had another friend, and Zoro didn't. Well, maybe you and Kobe could become friends, too. If he's scared of you, he'll definitely be scared of me. Everyone is, Zoro said quietly. Luffy replied, well, he only got scared when I looked at him like I was hungry. Besides that, he's okay with my drinking my blood around him. And you're only a wolf one night. Zoro was unconvinced. Zoro's awesome, he should have more friends. It's not like I don't want friends. I think I made a bad first meeting because I told my teacher to shut up. What? I sneezed and then she told me I should sneeze into my elbow. Zoro was getting increasingly mad at Luffy laughing about his woes. I get cranky. I'm on my own at school. Then, I'll get better and then I'll go to school with you and we'll be partners. Luffy suggested, but I don't know when I can go. Papa says he won't let me miss first grade. But that's still like, a bunch of months away, he added. Zoro took his thumb and split it on his sharp tooth. He held up the bleeding finger at the stunned Luffy. Does this make you thirsty? Zoro asked bluntly, completely unafraid. Luffy plugged his nose and swam away. Come on, it's good practice, and I'm not scared of being bit like Kobe. Luffy climbed out of the pool and ran across the yard until he didn't smell the blood anymore. Zoro's a meanie, he shouted, and called to be picked up by his papa. Zoro hurried over, and looked truly horrified at what he'd done. He apologized, but Luffy was angry at him. But the green-haired werewolf insisted it was all he could think of to help. I'm supposed to not want to drink blood. Zoro sputtered, how are you going to get used to other people bleeding around you, then? At least I'm, willing and understanding. Zoro was scared to lose Luffy, and tried to help how he could. Zoro's dad was in the bathroom, so he had to wait to call Katakuri. But he was calming down, and Zoro's wound already healed. Like Luffy, his condition allowed rapid healing. And besides, if you did lose control or anything, I'm pretty strong too, and I'll heal fast. But I'm sorry if I messed up. I just want to help you, he said sincerely. Luffy lost his anger, and said he forgave him. He was very different than Kobe in many ways. Do you promise to come to my school? And not Kobe's. Luffy didn't like feeling pulled by two different friends. Couldn't he be very best friends with both of them? But looking at Zoro's earnest expression, his worried, slightly hunched over, posture, it was clear he loved Luffy as his friend. He didn't want to be the second choice. And he was putting in more work than Kobe. But Luffy wasn't mad at either of them. He wasn't mad at Kobe, but he was hurt by the lack of trust from his friend. He understood why he felt that way, and wasn't mad. And he'd promised he'd change, so he had to fulfill that. If I don't go to Zoro's school, then he'll come to mine. Zoro smiled and nodded. They went back to the pool, and Zoro said he wouldn't bleed in front of his vampire friend again. I shouldn't be scared cause your blood is stinky. Zoro went red and his eye twitched. Shishishi. He asked about what Kobe's blood smelled like. Well, not yummy, but yummy. It's hard to explain. More like it was fresh. Like when you have baked bread and it's raw. He meant when it came out of the oven and the whole place smelled of the wonderful food. Oh, okay. Luffy hugged his friend suddenly. What the heck? He disliked physical affection. Luffy smiled at him and said, "You're a good friend. Though I don't think you would like Kobe a lot." Zoro flushed at the compliment, but did agree that he didn't seem compatible with Luffy's first friend. At least Kobe had more friends and wasn't ostracized by his classmates. Luffy had to work hard and work fast so he could be friends with Kobe, but he also didn't want to leave Zoro all alone and sat at his school. They played in the pool, and Luffy said nothing of their conversation with Katakuri. It was private and Zoro would be embarrassed if Luffy told his papa everything. And Katakuri might not like Zoro's approach, putting blood right in front of him and all. But Luffy knew he did it because he was trying to help. He liked Zoro a lot. Very different from Kobe. Papa, I gotta tell you something, Luffy said, sounding worried and frightened. Katakuri looked up from his book, worried but not showing it clearly. He closed it and sat up straight. Luffy was standing at his bedside. It was a quiet day, and Luffy had been playing with Legos in his playroom, listening to classical music. So seeing him suddenly looking worried was unusual. What is it? I drank Zoro's blood. Katakuri was stunned, and stared at him for a moment too long before shock and anger rushed through him. But Zoro wasn't dead or ill. Maybe it was a small nick, or an accident. Papa, why did you do that? Katakuri asked, keeping his anger in, needing to hear the whole story. Is Zoro alright? Luffy nodded, and climbed onto the bed. Zoro wanted to help me be friends with Kobe, so he said he was training. I didn't want to do it the first time, but then it was an accident the second time. But then it worked, kinda. What do you mean? So, Zoro was the one to initiate it. Katakuri knew he was an odd child, regardless of being a werewolf, but offering himself to a vampire as practice was quite strange. Wouldn't a child be afraid of vampires? Kobe had been working on being friends with Luffy, but he was reserved on calls and Luffy had to do most of the talking. I had some, and then I didn't feel hungry at all anymore. I didn't take that much. He said quickly. And Zoro can heal fast like me, so he's not hurt, too. Or either. He was gross at first, but better now. And how does he feel after it? He didn't really say anything bad. He said, how's that, how do you feel now? And was really nice about it. He didn't seem bothered or scared at all, even when I bit too hard. So Zoro hadn't just dribbled blood in Luffy's mouth, his kid full-on bit the other. Clearly nothing terrible came from it since Katakuri picked up Luffy, and Zoro was perfectly happy waving goodbye to him from his porch. Well, it wasn't bad or unhealthy for a vampire to drink from the source. He'd read that many adult vampires feed off of their significant others, but that could lead to unintentional deaths. But Luffy doing this made him uneasy. Zoro had to not have the same pain filter as others, being put in agony at least once a month for the whole night. Poor kid, but it still wasn't great in Katakuri's eyes. I don't want you to feed off of him, anymore. Something could go wrong and he could get very hurt. Well, he told me if he felt in danger, he'd lash out, too. So it would then turn into a bloody mess of a fight while they were both high on their non-human instincts. Katakuri said he didn't want Luffy to do that anymore. Okay, Luffy said sadly. He was mopey before Katakuri added a compliment at the end. But I'm proud you were able to restrain yourself with it. Zoro is a very reliable friend. You're very lucky. Quite the opposite of his other, very different friend. Zoro would be over that night to sleep over, as it was a Friday. He didn't want to make things awkward, so he wouldn't speak to the boy about this if it didn't come up. If the two were much older, Katakuri would say it was fine if both agreed, but the kids were 5 years old. Much too young for a dangerous act like that. But, it did prove that Zoro was dedicated in his role as a best friend. Yeah, Zoro's awesome. He accepts everything and isn't scared at all. He believed in me that I wasn't gonna hurt him. Katakuri heard the sentiment. It was a stark contrast to Kobe. Though he was weaker and could get hurt more easily than Zoro would. It was unfair to compare them to one another, but at least Luffy had Zoro if he lost the other. And his son had wanted to get better in public so he could rescue the lonely and bullied werewolf. Luffy didn't think about the fact that school could be very difficult for him, socially. He just wanted to not be led behind by his friends and go to school like normal little boys did. There was still a good 5 months until first grade started, and Katakuri had been giving him thought-stimulating talks and activities. Doing his absolute best to have Luffy mentally and educationally prepared in case he never ended up making it to kindergarten. Luffy wandered away to go play by himself again. Katakuri put his face in his hand and let out a sigh. Now he had to worry about Zoro as his friend, too. Kobe was worrisome over how detached he'd seemed to become in their relationship, barely speaking on the phone. And then there's on the opposite side of the spectrum, Zoro just offering his blood to Luffy and being totally fine with everything. When he came over, they all ate dinner, and Katakuri sat on the couch while they watched a movie. Luffy said Zoro wanted to watch scary movies, but Luffy said he wasn't allowed to. Thought Zoro was chill about watching a horrible movie that Luffy liked. Katakuri felt it was acid to the brain, but Luffy loved it. So when he watched it sometimes, Katakuri would be on his laptop. The vampire boy laughed at every bad joke every time he watched. Well, whatever he liked as long as it wasn't bad for him. Katakuri had left to the bathroom, and when he came back, Luffy had Zoro's finger in his mouth, both of them just staring at the screen. Katakuri saw Luffy swallow, and he called them out on it. "Luffy, what are you doing to Zoro's finger?" he asked sternly. Zoro yanked his hand away, and Luffy looked confused. "Great, were you just drinking Zoro's blood?" he offered it. Luffy said loudly, knowing he'd messed up. Katakuri looked at Zoro pointedly, and he tensed, looking awkward. "Zoro, why did you offer it?" Katakuri asked, putting the young boy on the spot. "I didn't even hear you two speak." The werewolf boy was unsure of what to say. Katakuri didn't let up his gaze, and Luffy was trying to scooch out of his sight. Well, Zoro had teary eyes, and looked upset on being put on the spot. So Katakuri sat down and relaxed, but asked for him to please explain. With Katakuri in a more relaxed state, Zoro looked a bit less like a deer caught in the headlights. "I don't know, I just thought he was hungry." "Were you hungry, Luffy?" He nodded. "And did you tell him that?" He shook his head. "So how do you know that Zoro offered?" I don't know. I just did." Katakuri sighed, and rubbed his face, seeming so tired. Luffy started to cry, and Katakuri hurried and said he wasn't angry with them. It hadn't hurt either of them. "But I messed up," Luffy cried. Zoro looked worried, but didn't know what to say. At least he didn't just offer to give him blood to feel better. "I'm sorry," Zoro said. "I don't know why I did it." "I don't know, really." Katakuri nodded, and put the movie back on, but firmly told them Luffy was not to drink from him anymore, and they agreed. Katakuri kept watch over them both the rest of the night, and when they went to bed, he deliberated over separating them. But he ended up having them sleep in the living room with the doors open. So Katakuri could easily get to them if he heard screaming in case things went south. They didn't, and both boys slept like babies. For a vampire and werewolf, they were cute as hell. Disclaimer: this story do not belong to me. The author is Parenting the Right Way by Kittyface 27 inches. Chapter 8, The Inevitable Split. Katakuri sat Luffy down at the table, and the boy looked curious. "Luffy, I know what happened with you and Zoro. About the times you're hungry, and he knows it. It's happened a few times since then, but you stopped, right?" "Yeah, I didn't drink anymore, I was a good boy." "That's good. But it was too late by now." "But when you drank from him, a link was formed between the two of you. Given the fact that werewolves and vampires aren't usually pairs or friendly with one another, this only happened twice, recorded. If you two are in the same immediate area, he will know when you are thirsty, and will have the urge to give you some of his blood. It is still his choice to say no, but there is that link, now. On his side of things, midnight has become hard for you to sleep through, right? You wake up at midnight every night, and have lately been having a tummy ache at the time. That's you sympathizing with his condition. Since midnight is very painful for werewolves, and Zoro wakes up then, you feel that, too. Both of you have a link to the other." Luffy just stared at him in confusion. "I don't understand. By Zoro giving you his blood, you have a new bond, like the friendship." "But he's my friend." "He is. But things have changed a bit." Luffy panicked and told Katakuri to call Zoro. "I've planned a sit-down talk with him and his father about this. They both should know, too." Luffy nodded, and looked troubled. While he was pouty, the phone rang, and Katakuri saw it was from Zoro's dad. He immediately got nervous, but answered the phone. "Hello. Katakuri-san, is Luffy okay?" "Why do you ask?" "I don't know, I felt worried all of a sudden." "Luffy is just fine, and will see you tomorrow." "Don't worry," Katakuri said kindly. Zoro was relieved, and easily got off the phone. The father was not angry at the boy, because he had no idea this would happen. He was just trying to help his friend out. But now they had to deal with this as best as they could. The 5-year-old was quiet all day, looking distracted and distant until he wanted to go to the park. So they did. They went to the nearest park with a playground. When they arrived to the play structure, Luffy started playing on the bars, going as fast as he could from one end to the other, beaming happily. He was glad Luffy didn't truly hate himself for his condition. The way Zoro didn't seem to hate himself. Well, that may just have not been seen by Luffy before. At school, Zoro was having a hard time making friends. The kid was awkward at best and abrasive at worst. He spoke his mind, mostly unashamedly. When Luffy was supposed to talk to Kobe, he cancelled, not in the mood to see someone who disliked him for such thing, and would never want to hear about what he and Zoro did, and what came from it. So he was nervous and quiet, but Katakuri made sure to show him he wasn't angry with him. So he just played with him, and even had Oven come over for a barbecue to try and cheer him up, which distracted Luffy very easily. Food and fun was the cure for much of his bouts of sadness and extreme pouts. When he went to bed, he drank some tea before, even if he could have an accident during the night. He chose sleeping over wetting the pull-ups. Zoro didn't think he was bad for it all, and didn't shame him one bit. Neither did Kobe, though. So that was good. Katakuri stayed up later and had a list of things to say and how to say them. He felt that Zoro's father would be understanding, but there was still a specific way he wanted to present the information he'd researched the hell out of for hours the night before. It had really only happened a few times. It didn't work this way for regular people, or all people who were fed off of by vampires, willingly or not, would have this connection. This would probably not happen to anyone else Luffy encountered or ended up drinking from. Zoro was special. Katakuri hoped he'd take the news okay. Luffy sat at the table next to Zoro, and he could feel extra nervous, and saw Zoro look the same way. His father didn't shame Luffy about it, even though he regret drinking from Zoro, and was just glad it didn't feel like his fault for asking. Zoro just offered. So they sat there, Luffy knowing the topic and Zoro not. Zoro's dad was curious but didn't seem too nervous. Maybe because Katakuri looked relaxed. So, the man carefully explained the fruits of his deep research. Kushiro looked at Zoro sharply when he heard the boy offered a vampire his blood like it was no big deal. Maybe he though Zoro should be wary of bites. Not that Luffy's left a scar like the nasty one he got from the werewolf that bit him on a trip to the bathroom at a campsite. His face was sweaty, and he looked confused. Is there bad stuff from it? Zoro asked before his father could. Nothing very bad, but if you two ever aren't friends anymore, you'll still have this bond, probably. There's no guarantee given how little examples I found, but I felt it was information we should all be aware of. What were you thinking, Zoro? You could have caused problems for both yourself and Luffy, Kushiro said in frustration, and Zoro slumped his shoulders. He just wanted to help Luffy, and had no idea this would happen. You won't have your blood drunk by Luffy again. Katakuri agreed. Luffy was a bit sad inside for losing a very nice experience. Drinking from Zoro, no matter how little, had made him feel warm and fuzzy and safe. He didn't know how Zoro felt about it, but should ask, even if it didn't matter if they weren't allowed to. I'm still friends with him, right? The green-haired one asked sharply, voice defensive and challenging. Of course, you can still be friends with him. I just want both of you to think before you act when it comes to your conditions especially. Think of the consequences, like when Luffy goes into the sunlight without enough sunscreen, or your worry when the gate is loose when you transform, Kushiro said in a serious, stern voice. Both boys nodded, saying they would be more careful. Kushiro was still annoyed, but Luffy was very happy he still let Zoro be his friend. The two ended up going shopping for groceries with Katakuri. Just to get them distracted by doing something to take up attention after the important and loaded conversation. More like a briefing. There was a second car seat that was especially for Zoro, and previously Kobe. In the car, Luffy spoke. I shouldn't tell Kobe. He'll get scared and be even more not trying, he said in a small voice, wringing his hands and looking at his feet that didn't touch the floor of the car. Luffy felt a twinge of irritation, and looked up to see Zoro with a sour face on. But the feeling wasn't an actual emotion he felt. More like an alert that his friend was irritated. He's not a good friend. It's been weeks, Luffy, Zoro said in a firm voice. The other looked down, and he knew deep down that he was right. Luffy was doing his best, going out in public more, telling Kobe about his progress. But he never seemed very interested or engaged in their calls. It didn't make Luffy happy, and every time he got off the phone, he felt disappointed and hurt. He was thinking of telling these feelings to his first friend, but was afraid of the reaction. Papa stayed quiet in the front seat, and Luffy couldn't see his face from where he sat. I wanted to talk about it, but I don't want to make it all more bad, Luffy said quietly. I understand that feeling, but sometimes you have to do what's best for you, even if it can be upsetting. We'll talk more when we get home. But I'll buy you both a popsicle after we go shopping. This distracted both children, who were happy to have one. Luffy especially. He hadn't had a real popsicle in a long time. He mostly had ice cubes made of juice. When they entered the store, as always, Luffy felt the smell of all the living bodies around him. He had a mochi rope around his wrist, no longer needing the harness to keep him from running off or getting separated. He stuck by Katakuri's side, always in his field of vision. He tried to not plug his nose, and saw Zoro looking bothered, too. Sorry, do you smell it? No, more like a feeling of knowing you're not feeling nice all of a sudden. It sucks. Don't say bad words, Luffy replied. Zoro didn't reply to that, and held his hand to stay together. They had a cart, and went shopping for everything. Katakuri and Luffy were better off than Zoro and his dad, but it never caused problems because Zoro was happy with his life and wasn't old enough to stress about money. Neither was Luffy. Luffy's nose was uncomfortable like usual, but not as bad. Not as bad as it almost always was. But if he was getting better, then he could go to school soon. He couldn't wait. He loved his papa and spending lots of time with him, but he did want to go to school. While they shopped, they came across two little boys, and Zoro hurried to hide behind a display of flowers. Katakuri and Luffy both noticed, and stopped. Is there a problem? The man wondered. Zoro was looking uncomfortable at the two boys. Those are mean people from my class, he admitted. Luffy glared in their direction. Let's just go away from them. They'll be mean to Luffy, too. So they did as Zoro wished, and avoided the family while they shopped, and did not come face to face with them. They were gone by the time it was time to check out. Luffy and Zoro helped bag the food, and got in an argument of whether eggs should go on top of the milk or not. The cashier seemed to be annoyed by how long they were taking, so Katakuri helped move things along, and everything was sorted out. Luffy carried the big pouch of apples to show he was helpful and strong. When they got home, food was started, and he and Zoro went to play outside in the evening sun, the vampire reapplying more sunscreen. Katakuri kept watch, but nobody was bitten and nothing abnormal happened. Katakuri held and rocked Luffy as he screamed and wailed at the pain he was feeling from Zoro's full moon night. The pain wasn't as bad, and Luffy's body wasn't reforming, but he felt a lot of pain through the bond. Katakuri thought this would happen, so he'd had him sleep in his room so he could be with Luffy if it happened. Luffy was inconsolable, and so all they could do was wait for the sun to come up. He wished this bond had never been formed and complicated things. But poor Zoro must be in agony if Luffy was this bad. He didn't exaggerate pain levels, and didn't complain over little pains like stubbing his toe. So this pain was very bad. He tried giving Luffy some sedatives, some sleeping pills, but the pain persisted and he remained awake until the sun rose, and was exhausted by the time Zoro should be back in human form, and immediately fell asleep. It was so hard to watch and listen to and be unable to help at all. When he woke up, Luffy didn't actually remember anything of the night. He didn't remember the pain he was in. It was a strange relief. But he did call Zoro immediately, even before breakfast, to see if he was okay. Zoro, to his credit, sounded just fine. I'm okay. It was like every other full moon. Why? 'Cause I felt it all night, too. I don't remember, but Papa said I was screaming and crying until the moon went down. Luffy explained. Zoro was upset he had to feel that. I'm your friend, and now you're not alone. Luffy replied, finding something positive in the unfortunate situation. Katakuri smiled as he cooked orange juice pancakes. I decided, Luffy said suddenly while playing on the Wii, swinging his arm while playing tennis. With him unable to go outside all the time to play hard, Katakuri managed to find someone selling a Wii and a collection of games. So here he was, playing tennis against the game. Katakuri looked up from his work, and asked what he decided. I'm gonna not be friends with Kobe anymore, he said bluntly. Katakuri put his laptop next to him, his face grim. When it is with Zoro and Kobe, Zoro's a lot better. I don't think Kobe wants to be friends anymore, too. That was clear to both of them. No matter how hard Luffy tried to fix things, to act normal over the phone, every time he was turned down or got non-committal reposes, it hurt him. He didn't want to hurt anymore. And he wouldn't be alone with cutting Kobe out. He had his own friends, too, so it should be fine. Katakuri asked if he was absolutely sure. Yeah, he's not being a good friend to me at all. Makes me feel bad and wrong, Luffy replied in firm, determined voice. He'd made up his mind fully. I wanna tell him today, he added. Katakuri still talked to Makino, even when Kobe and Luffy weren't close anymore. Luffy hadn't attacked anybody, but still, Kobe didn't really care. Luffy was done with putting in the effort only to be hurt by the pink-haired boy's lack of interest and insincerity. It would hurt to end it, but the hurt wouldn't continued on with every phone call. He had Zoro to get over the true loss of his first friend. But he hadn't been his friend in months. It was time to let go, even if the 5-year-old was holding back tears of sadness by hitting the ball even harder. But he swung too hard, and the Wiimote flung out of his hand and shattered the TV. Luffy cried about it, feeling guilty and sorry he broke it. Don't worry, that TV wasn't too expensive, Katakuri soothed. But Luffy sobbed more, his feelings over Kobe coming out in the tears that started being about the broken TV. His papa rubbed his back up and down and didn't try to make him stop crying, just letting him get it all out. He didn't end up calling Kobe that night, bummed over the TV and how he couldn't watch his favorite cartoons on the big screen. So he used the tablet in his lap to watch before bedtime. They'd order a new TV that would be delivered the next day. The sound sure had scared Karina, and she hid for the rest of the night. Luffy needs to speak with Kobe. Is he available for a long call today? Katakuri texted Makino. He was sad their friendship would end, as both of their parents had been through a lot together. With her leaving Dragon to the time Luffy was in rehab, he knew their friendship would likely not last long if both of their sons cut contact completely. Is it to end the friendship? Katakuri told the truth, and affirmed this. Alright, call at 3 o'clock. Makino was unsurprised. She'd obviously noticed Kobe's lack of interest or drive to keep the friendship. Katakuri looked down the hall to Luffy's bathroom. He was putting a soak-on tattoo on his arm that he got from his cereal box. Katakuri was sitting on the couch, and leaned back, looking at the tall ceiling. Today would probably be unpleasant. When Luffy was done with the Sokon tattoo, Katakuri sighed at seeing he'd stuck it on his forehead. The boy now had a red bird on his left temple. Luckily, it didn't get into his hairline. Look, I see. You said you were going to put it on your arm, Katakuri replied lightly. But then I thought I would see my face more. You can only see your face in the mirror. If it was on your arm, you could look at it anytime you wanted, the father explained with an amused smile as Luffy gasped. Well, hopefully you'll get a second one and can put that one on your arm. Papa is very smart. Thank you, I did work hard to get my master's degree, Katakuri replied with a smile. Luffy beamed and giggled, and for the next hour or so, would run to the bathroom often to see his tattoo until Katakuri got a small mirror out so he didn't need to go to the bathroom every time to look. When he tried to draw the bird, it turned out just like a 5-year-old's drawing would. The only thing that resembled the inspiration was the color. Luffy proudly showed Katakuri his work, and the father praised it highly, and then stuck it on the fridge, the ultimate compliment. Only Luffy's best work went there. Which was at the moment a worm made of glued raw pasta pieces, a snail made of rainbow pipe cleaners, and a drawing of a wolf and bat. It was of course false that vampires turned into bats, and was borderline offensive, but it was what it was. Luffy was not easily offended about his condition. Though he'd never been around people who challenged him on it, he would have to learn how to deal with that later in his life. When 3 o'clock came near, Katakuri reminded him of the call with Kobe. He was unsurprised to see Luffy's decision had not wavered. He slept on it, played on it, talked about it, but still had the same goal. To protect himself from the harm of the feelings Kobe's behavior caused. You're sure about this? Is it the right thing? Is it wrong to do? Luffy asked, looking at his pale, soft hands. It is for your own well-being. Sometimes doing the hard thing is definitely the right one. The decision is yours, but I don't think you're in the wrong. You did your absolute best to keep your friendship going. Sadly, it seems Kobe just isn't in the same mindset. People often grow apart, and sometimes it's very sad, Katakuri explained, and Luffy was crying quietly. But he wasn't backing down, and his father was very proud of him. Luffy didn't want to see Kobe's reaction, he wanted it to be over a phone call. When they called, Katakuri had one big hand brushing up and down against Luffy's back, something that soothed him and he called, the goosebumps. He liked the goosebumps from them, and this would hopefully help him out. Hello, Katakuri, Luffy. Kobe, Luffy is calling, Makino said, and Kobe came over. Katakuri didn't know the expression on the woman, but he could hear a sad smile in her voice. Hi, Luffy, Kobe said. I gotta to say something. Then he came out right with it. I don't wanna be your friend anymore. 'Cause you don't look to want to be my friend when I try so hard to be better. His face was tight, but his voice didn't waver. Part of Katakuri did wish he could see what was on the other screen, but the silence that came was just awkward and confusing. But Kobe sniffled and said, okay, I shoulda said something about it too. I don't either. Luffy's lips pressed tightly together, but he didn't ask why. Katakuri was glad he didn't ask. Makino spoke next. Sometimes, people change and aren't compatible anymore. I think it's very brave of both of you to face uncomfortable feelings head on and are honest about it. Maybe someday you both can be friends again, who knows? She said brightly, even if Katakuri could hear the emotion in her voice. Nobody was happy with this outcome, but it had to happen for both boys' well-being. But Luffy impressed Katakuri immensely. I will always be a vampire. I have to be with people who accept me and want me anyways. If Kobe can't, I don't want to be friends again. Katakuri's jaw dropped, but then he closed it once again, feeling amazed by the maturity in his words. But his situation demanded this kind of thinking about himself. He was right. Luffy would forever have vampirism, and can't be around people who hate him for it. I just hope Kobe had another friend to be with. Makino said, Kobe will be okay for both of you to move on as different people. She was giving Luffy assurance that he could go forward without feeling he left his friend all alone in the world. The vampire boy said he was glad of that. I think Zoro will be good for my best friend cause he's like me. I hope Kobe finds other people like him, also. But it didn't seem either boy knew how to end the call, so Katakuri stepped in. You'll both have fond memories of one another, so why don't we end it on a more positive note? Both of you will grow into stronger people by letting go of a relationship that is no longer working. Luffy would most likely not have clear memories of his time with Kobe, but he had to say something like that. Luffy was silently racking with sobs. Good luck in life, Kobe. Do what you want in life, not what anyone else wants you to. Dragon was no longer there to abuse or shape him how he wanted to. Irate and sad though he was with Kobe's apathy in the friendship, or his inability to act on his emotions, he never wished harm on him or for anything unfortunate to happen. After all, he threw a friendship away because he felt that way. Kobe and Makino should grow up happily with Kobe's older siblings. Bye-bye, Katakuri and Luffy, Kobe said. Bye, Luffy replied. The phone call was over, and Luffy shook with sobs. Katakuri hugged him, and then Zoro called. Luffy took the phone. Zoro. He wailed into the phone, scaring his friend who called in worry. They talked, and Katakuri stayed out of it while Zoro did his best to console Luffy, though the man knew he had to be pleased he was now number one as a friend. He no longer needed to be insecure about actually being Luffy's best friend. Zoro was a great kid. Kobe was a great kid, too, but maybe not paired to Luffy. Maybe things would have always gone south. But hanging onto a dead friendship could be toxic, so this was for the best in Luffy's case. After Luffy was off the phone and went to drink 2 full bottles of blood and then silently went to his playroom to mope or think or just be by himself, Katakuri texted Makino, asking how Kobe was doing. He seems he is unable to process what happened. How is Luffy? He was crying, but called and talked to Zoro to feel better. Now he's sitting in his playroom by himself. I think he did very well in expressing his feelings. I agree. Hopefully Kobe will someday be able to be more inclusive. But he's only 5, he still has a lot left to rekindle with Luffy if it's meant to be. I just hope this is what's right for both of them. Does Kobe have anyone else? He has a friend at school. She's very nice and they get along. But it isn't how it has been for him and Luffy. I think it was right for Luffy to break away. Kobe wasn't going to be able to commit anymore. Katakuri was glad Makino was objective about it. Luffy breaking up could hurt Kobe, but she cared about both of them, not only Kobe. She was a good mother. He wondered what Dragon was like, now. Katakuri didn't pay much attention to the news about him as a hero, so he had no idea what he'd been up to lately. And, well, he didn't much care. He'd burnt the bridge and had no desire to rekindle with a man who abused their family and young children. Especially now that he has his own kiddo. Chapter 9, completely unexpected. Papa, this way. Let's go that way. Luffy cried while they were walking out of the supermarket. Luffy had his dinosaur backpack on full of apples, which would be heavy for any other 5-year-old child. He bounced up and down, pointing down the street. What's that way? Katakuri asked, but didn't discourage this. They had nowhere to be, so he started walking with him. It was nice he didn't wander off, even when extremely interested in something. A vampire, Luffy said brightly. Hurry, hurry, he insisted. Katakuri did quicken his face a bit, and had Luffy stand a few inches behind him, just in case. But it couldn't be a pureblood because it was daytime. Afternoon, so the sun wasn't out to harm Luffy, who was slathered in sunscreen. When they came around the corner, they saw a police officer, smoking 2 cigars, and looking grumpy. There, it's him. He was still bouncing up and down. Do you want to say hello? Katakuri asked. The man was an officer, he wasn't going to harm Luffy. And he'd never met another vampire. This guy was pale and had red eyes, but he was also extremely buff and manly. Luffy nodded vehemently. But of course the officer heard and or smelled them. He made eye contact with Luffy and raised his brows, pulling his sunglasses down a bit. He handed what seemed to be a sandwich to another officer nearby, and approached the small child. Luffy was absolutely buzzing, eyes bright and wide. Hello, kid. My name is Smoker. I'm Luffy. You're like me, right? He asked loudly. If you mean a vampire, then yes. I knew it, Luffy squealed. Katakuri was smiling lightly. Smoker opened his jacket, and pulled out a sticker. Luffy gasped at seeing the sticker. He still had his original one framed and on the wall in the hallway. It had been salvaged from the flood, much to his happiness. A sticker. He was so excited and happy. Smoker handed him the sticker. You sure are a little vampire. How old are you? I'm 5. I'm going to school soon because I'm more safe around people now. Luffy exclaimed proudly. That sure sounds exciting. To be your age and go through training already. Quite the feat. My best friend is a werewolf and so we'll be a team at school. Luffy said with conviction. Quite the pair. Is this your family? Yeah, this is Papa. Katakuri gave his name with a greeting. He's a good papa, too. Katakuri smiled. Smokey, are you an officer? That's right. Cool. Do you want to be an officer? No way. I'm gonna be a zookeeper for dinosaurs cause science can bring them back one day. So when that happens, I'll be one of the workers. Ever since Zoro told Luffy about Jurassic Park, the kid had been peddling the conspiracy theory hard. But he was a kid and it was a kid thing to think about. He'd grow out of it. That sure sounds scary. But you're an officer vampire. You can't be scared, Luffy said in confusion. Smoker ruffled his hair, and said fear was not your enemy, but your friend. After all, fear could keep you out of trouble and save your life. You should keep a lid on your fears, though. Don't be scared to live life, but live life acknowledging those fears. Then he got a message on his walkie-talkie. It was nice meeting you, Luffy. Can I have a picture? So Katakuri took a photo of the 2 vampires, and they waved goodbye as Smoker got on his motorcycle and drove away, the alarm blaring now. Did you see? Katakuri nodded, and showed Luffy the photo. Smoker looked grumpy but had his thumbs up. He's a vampire grumpy grump. That indeed. Let's go home before the groceries get any warmer. Luffy was ecstatic all day, and had a new topic to speak about besides school that he would finally go to the following Monday. Only 2 months left of the school year, but better late than never. Luffy was nervous but excited. Papa wasn't showing any worry, just happy for his son as they drove to the school. It wasn't the one closest to them, but it was the school Zoro attended. He was waiting for them outside of the school, holding his pumpkin backpack straps tightly. He looked nervous but also very relieved he would no longer be alone. Jumping off the seat, he face planted, but stood up just fine and laughed it off. Katakuri crouched in front of him. Remember, leave the room if it gets overwhelming. You have 3 pouches in your backpack. Your teacher and the helpers know everything, so don't worry about leaving the room. Luffy nodded sharply, face determined. It was only 4 hours and then he'd be picked up at lunchtime, where Luffy would be safely inside, away from the noon sun. I love you, have fun, okay. And remember what we talked about. Yeah, he'd given Luffy all sorts of compliments to remember if he was treated badly. Katakuri got up, and walked the boys to the classroom. Luffy was holding Zoro's hand tightly, slightly swinging their arms. Relief wafted off of the werewolf, not being all alone anymore. When Luffy entered the bright room, it was filled by the smell of kids. He never smelled this many in one place. But he didn't feel any urge to drink them, all of them with the scent of sweet blood. He beamed, happy to be at school. The teacher was a woman with a strange pink hairstyle. Some of her head was shaved and other parts weren't. She led Luffy to a cubby with his name, and he put his backpack in there. You have coolers in there for your juice, right? She asked, Miss Belmere. Luffy nodded. Then we'll just leave that there. Welcome to kindergarten, Luffy. Thanks. Luffy replied brightly. He hurried back to Zoro and then tried to meet with everyone, telling them his name. But many weren't having it, and avoided him. Papa said some people didn't like vampires, and that was okay. He had no emotional attachment like he had with Kobe, so it didn't break his heart. It warned him who would be friend material and who wouldn't. When it was time to sit on the carpet, Zoro seemed to keep wanting to isolate himself by sitting in the corner. Luffy wasn't having that, and made them sit in the middle in the front. He kept holding his hand, and Zoro hated being in the middle of everyone. They were making side looks at Luffy, who was just happy to be at school. He liked being happy, and would try to make sure that he stayed that way. Even if some people were not nice, he still wanted to enjoy school, regardless of him starting super late. They worked on their ABCs, which Katakuri had taught Luffy how to say. He was able to get to S before he forgot. Many couldn't get that far, so Luffy felt smart. Zoro could get all the way to the end, though, and he was so cool. When playtime came, Luffy tried making more friends. But, you drink blood, right? A girl with green hair and looking bothered said, holding her stuffed bear tightly to her chest in fear. Yeah, but it's from a juice box and we buy it. Luffy replied honestly. He did not mention his relationship with Zoro when it came to blood. They thought it was gross, but Luffy was unbothered, and said it was hard to explain what it tasted like. Do you attack people? Like the werewolf? The green-haired girl said again. This finally made Luffy upset, and he sternly said Zoro's name was Zoro. But he's a werewolf. Then I'll call you human, Luffy replied. There's lots of you here, so the peoples that call Zoro, werewolf, will be humans with numbers then, he explained. Zoro came up and told him to stop getting upset over him. But you're my best friend. I gotta defend you, Luffy insisted. Zoro said, don't you want friends, too? I don't wanna ruin that for you. I don't wanna be friends with people who are mean to you, Luffy said with a frown on. Zoro's face crumpled, and he started to cry. Luffy was surprised, and hugged him, patting his back. But through the feeling bond, the reaction wasn't sadness but overwhelming relief. Miss Belmere came over and asked if everything was alright. Zoro's just happy, Luffy said with a smile to their teacher. It did cause a scene, the whole argument, and people were looking at Luffy in a different way than before. Let's go play with dinosaur toys, Zoro. Zoro nodded, wiping his eyes, and the two bustled to the play area with all the little figures. While they were playing, a boy came over, looking shy and embarrassed. Luffy looked up, and Zoro looked kind of tired and blank. He had been sobbing, but happy, so Luffy was not too worried. He just cried and it made him tired. I'm Kappa. I've been mean to Zoro sometimes. I'm sorry, Kappa said. He had a white turban on his head with orange beads around it. Didn't look like a very nice boy, but Luffy wouldn't judge by appearance or he'd be just as bad as those who disliked him without knowing him. Luffy asked him why he was mean to Zoro. I don't know, he mumbled, looking away. Oh, well, don't be mean anymore, then, Luffy said bluntly. Being mean isn't good and you're a mean person if you're not nice to others. Kappa sniffled and nodded, and then hurried away. Luffy heard him outside and crying. He didn't really feel bad because he was mean to Zoro for no reason. Gradually, a few other kids came over to apologize to Zoro, who was shocked at the developments. And Luffy was upset with how many people had been mean to Zoro, and how shocked he was at receiving kindness from them. Luffy would never let anyone bully Zoro again. Not while he was there to help. When school was over, and Katakuri picked his son up after they waited with Zoro for his dad to pick him up, Luffy began to rant in the car, surprising the man. Luffy started crying over how sad he was for Zoro, to be all alone all this time. You're a good friend, Luffy. Zoro is a very lucky boy. I'll protect him. He's my best friend forever. Katakuri smiled proudly at his child. They went home, and Luffy was finally speaking about the fun times he had with all the toys, and the playground, and how he didn't want to drink anybody's blood at all. But I had some in the bathroom from Zoro. Does that count? Luffy, I told you you can't drink his blood, especially in public, Katakuri said, trying to sound patient. Oh, okay, Luffy replied lightly. When they got inside, Luffy hurried to his room to dress in his pajamas but still keep his beloved flip-flops on. He was happy he was allowed to wear them to school. He ran back out and wanted to talk to Zoro, so Katakuri lended Luffy his phone to speak to his friend. Something smells icky, Papa, Luffy said, plugging his nose. They were at the park after his nap after school. Luffy wanted some fresh air, but the backyard was apparently unacceptable today. So they went to the park, and Luffy was drawing in a coloring book on the picnic blanket while Katakuri was reading a book. The father smelled deeply, but didn't smell anything. What's it smell like? Too much candy and perfume. He looked grossed out, and pointed towards the parking lot. Katakuri looked over, and saw someone there, and his eyes widened in shock and anger. What was she doing here? How did she know where Katakuri even lived? She was supposed to have life in prison. Luffy saw Katakuri's expression, and started to worry and wonder if something really bad was there. Let's clean up our things, he said ightly. That person will just keep being smelly. But I don't want you to go towards that smell ever. It's stinky, I won't. Katakuri helped him put his various toys back in his backpack and folded up the blanket, got his own things, and they walked in the opposite direction. Their car was where Mama was, so they couldn't go that way. 1,000 thoughts were racing through the man's mind, but were all encompassed by the general feeling of hate and confusion. Why was he not told? Did his siblings know? He hadn't seen the abusive mother, if you could even call her that, in over 20 years. He looked down at Luffy, who was slapping his feet into his bottom with every bouncy step, clueless to the worry going on in Katakuri's head. He was not going to entertain the thought of forgiving her. She did a great deal of mental damage to his younger siblings. To all of them, but Pudding and Cracker especially. She would have zero contact with Katakuri and Luffy. But he didn't even know how to speak with her. He just wanted to get a restraining order and be done with it. That was what he would do. The two walked in a big loop and back around to their car. Mama was gone by then, and Katakuri buckled Luffy in, and drove them away, glad the park wasn't too close to their home. But how did she know they'd be there? He needed to get on top of this immediately. He had no idea the reason to approach them, or not. She just watched them like a creep. But he wouldn't listen to any excuses. Mama was not to be part of their lives. Never. Luffy seemed fine with no grandparents, only uncles and aunts, and Katakuri would never try to get him to want them. Zoro had one grandparent, but they weren't close, so Luffy was never really around the concept of loving grandparents. When they got home, Luffy went to his playroom to watch cartoons, and Katakuri called up Sparrow, the eldest sibling. He was 43. Brother Puro, did you know Mama is out of jail? He asked, not sparing a second and getting right to it. What, so you didn't know? She showed up at the park where Luffy and I were. He smelled her. She didn't approach, just watched. Why weren't we told? He sounded pissed and upset, too. None of them had a good relationship or fond memories of her. She was abusive and manipulative to all of them, treated them like trash. Katakuri said he was getting started on a restraining order that night. How did she know where you were? I don't know, but I'm calling the police for tonight in case she comes here somehow. At least she can't use her quirk on any of us. Her quirk nerves had been fried by a curling iron when she was high. It burnt deep into her neck in just the wrong spot to render her quirk useless. Which she then took out on them by beating Daifuku with a pipe until they called for help. After she was taken in, her record of all the people she'd killed was found and she was sentenced to life in prison. It happened so fast, and the kids were out of her care almost instantly. They had no other family, so the kids were spread out in foster homes. They managed to keep in touch, but had never been living in the same place again. Since all of them had had pretty big behavioral issues from her treatment, most were never adopted and had to set out on their own once they became adults. But all of them had been forced to mature early, and each were fairly comfortable now, living wise. And since all their parents were different, luckily nobody had Mama's quirk, which she used to steal souls from people and put them in everyday objects. 42 murders using her quirk. Even 20 years wasn't enough for her to be forgiven and let out.
Yo, quick pause, smash that like button, hit subscribe if you're new here, share this video, and tell me in the comments which part you're loving the most.
They contacted all of the other siblings, but none knew about her getting out, either. Luffy wasn't listening in because he showed not an ounce of stress or worry the rest of the day. It was a school night, so after Katakuri read him his storybook for Wednesday nights, he went to bed, perfectly fine. Katakuri would never expose his family's toxicity to his son. His mother was poison and ruined everything she touched. Quirkless now or not, she was dangerous and he didn't want her anywhere near Luffy. In the morning, Katakuri called for a police escort to school, just to make sure. When the guy asked what it was for, Katakuri honestly said his homicidal mother got out of jail and approached him and his son the day before. This was taken very seriously, and Luffy was escorted to school, the cop car driving a bit behind them. Luffy didn't notice, didn't pick up on anything. He was a vampire, so was perceptive automatically, but he was also only 5, a young child. When he dropped Luffy off, the officer offered to stick around for a bit after he left. Katakuri was grateful for this, and nodded. He then left to meet with his siblings at Smoothie's home to try and figure out what to do, what was going on. Once they were all in one place, which hadn't happened but for a few Christmases ago, they were all stressed and bothered. Worried and anxious. Oven had a friend who was a lawyer and so he was present too. Most of them were all very tall considering size had nothing to do with their various quirks. So, none of you received any notice that your biological mother was released from prison. They shook their heads. Bogard, the lawyer friend, sighed. Do you know where she was being held? She was in a maximum security prison in South Korea, Daifuku said. Nobody touched the lemonade or apple chips on the table in front of them all. We haven't talked to her in over 20 years. While they were all together, they called the prison, and had a translator to speak to them. But when they heard the truth, they all went pale. Mama managed to break out of prison. At hearing Katakuri saw her, immediately, the police were called, and all of the siblings would be guarded as the search was organized. They had a huge lead over where she was now. The breakout had been months ago. And Bogard said that the prison she broke out of should have alerted them all and they could sue them for not doing so and possibly putting them in danger from the cover-up. Katakuri was very upset and worried over his son's safety. She broke out of prison, and then saw Katakuri had a child and she had a grandchild. Not that he saw her as a mother figure personally. So, the search was on, and Katakuri hurried to Luffy's school to pick him up. The officer was gone, and he felt paranoid until a cop car pulled into the lot. The car that would be guarding them both. Luffy came out under his umbrella since it was a very clear day and the sun was high above. Zoro was smiling, which was a relief. Luffy's presence really changed him about school. Katakuri was proud of him for being such a good friend. Even if he still did disapprove about the blood bond. Though he didn't hold it against either of them since they had no idea it was possible. Katakuri waited with Zoro, Luffy in the backseat. Katakuri, is everything okay? Zoro asked, much less clueless than Luffy was. He looked up curiously, wondering that now, too. Things are alright, but I just want you to be extra careful about something. If you see this woman, call the police and get away, he said, and showed Zoro an old photo of Mama. Zoro asked who she was. A bad woman that I don't want either of you being around. Luffy saw the photo, but didn't recognize her, as he'd only smelled her and seen her from a distance. Is she bad? Yes, and we don't want to be around her, Katakuri replied. When Zoro's dad showed up, Katakuri calmly explained about the situation, and he knew what to do if she came. But he and Zoro shared the same quirk. He'd be able to defend them with his weapon power. When Katakuri got back in the car, the two of them headed home. When they got there, they saw a window was broken. Luffy was confused, and asked if the neighbor threw a baseball at them. The officer in the car who pulled up behind them called for backup, just in case. But Luffy said nobody was inside. Katakuri did trust his senses, but wanted to be overly careful if necessary. Besides, she could have left something dangerous there. Katakuri looked worried and frantic, and Luffy clearly saw this. He unclipped himself from the backseat and climbed through the gap in the driver's and passenger seat and hugged Katakuri. Don't worry. It'll be okay, he said brightly. He hugged him close, too. He'd never put this child in danger. Luffy was his baby, and Katakuri would do everything possible to preserve his innocence as best as he could. Papa, Luffy screamed on the trampoline, his father under the eave of the back patio, looking focused on the paperwork he was working on about the scary grandma. He'd told him about the bad lady they had to watch out for. And Luffy already had her scent, so she couldn't sneak up on him. He wasn't scared and trusted the police to do their job. He wasn't interrupting his stressed-out papa while he worked besides going over every half hour or so to give a big hug. That was how he helped him through the stressed time. Luffy hated seeing him sad or not happy, and wanted to do what he could to make him happy. But this would probably worry him. Katakuri looked up and shouted in shock, running to the trampoline and grabbing Luffy's hand before he floated out of reach. He'd jumped a big jump, and then had suddenly been airborne. He was floating away, but a mochi rope was wrapped around his waist and connected to his father's wrist. Are you okay? How do you feel? The father asked in worry, confused as he got his phone to call someone. Luffy nodded, but was confused as to why he had started to float. He was quirkless. He wasn't 4 anymore. Did it have to do with being a vampire? I'm okay, my tummy hurts a little bit, though, Luffy admitted, just noticing a bubbly feeling in his belly. He was sat on the couch and Katakuri went outside and fetched all the snacks he'd had, along with the bottle of blood he'd drunk that was washed out and in the biohazard bin. Luffy was no longer floating. So, in front of them was a small bowl of raisins, some nuts and the blood bottle. Luffy had eaten a handful of both snacks. My tummy is bubbly, but it isn't bad, I think. And I'm not farty. Katakuri was going to call someone about it regardless. Especially when he started to drift up towards the ceiling again. He screamed and laughed about flying, unbothered by the current developments. Katakuri had zero idea on what the hell caused this. Quirks didn't manifest after 4 years old. And he was already declared quirkless by a doctor. On the phone, he heard that Luffy should be brought to the Quirk hospital for monitoring. So they packed some things for the night in Luffy's suitcase, a little baggie of his toys, and his favorite pillow. He stayed on the ground, thankfully, and was clipped to his seat easily. The drive to the nearest Quirk hospital was fairly long, and he fell asleep on the way. Katakuri could see he was floating in his seat. His bum was just barely off of the seat, still clipped securely in. He already was stressed about Mama and wherever the hell she was, not bothering any of them but still not caught, so he didn't want medical problems to come up with Luffy, too. He tapped his thumbs on the steering wheel, and when he got to the large hospital, he took Luffy's belongings and then the boy himself. Mochi was wrapped around Luffy and Katakuri to make sure he was secured to his chest while he walked them and the belongings inside. It was nighttime by now, and the waiting room wasn't very busy. There was one person there, a boy with fluffy red hair down the middle of his head, and a bright red, large furry arm that didn't match the rest of his body. He was maybe Luffy's age, an angry-looking boy, but was alone. More focused on his own kid, Katakuri assumed he wasn't alone because there was someone at the front desk and watching him. "Luffy, we're here," the little boy mumbled and looked up, eyes droopy. "Sleepy. I called in about an hour ago, about my quirkless son starting floating. I was told he should be kept under observation here," Katakuri explained to the front desk woman. With him being a young child and nobody in the waiting room, it wasn't surprising that they were seen quickly. His things were taken by another worker so Katakuri wasn't lugging around a bunch of objects in a suitcase. Luffy was fine to be carried to the room. It was clearly the children's area now with all the colored polka dots on the ceiling and drinking fountain in the shape of a cat in the wall. Luffy was fascinated by that, but didn't say anything, only watching it leave his sight with an open mouth and wide eyes. When they were in the right room, Luffy was put on a very luxurious-looking bed. Katakuri saw why it was so nice. There were bars on all sides on the floor. They would probably be raised up to confine someone to the bed. It would most likely be that way for Luffy, to keep him from floating too high. "Well, hello, there. My name is Potson. Who might you be?" "I'm Luffy," he said brightly, even if he looked sleepy. His tummy grumbled. They hadn't had dinner, and had been driving through that time of the day. Dr. Potson said Luffy could have some dinner in a bit. "I'm a big boy, so I can wait a little bit." "Very nice. Many boys your age aren't so flexible. Now, why don't you tell me what adventure brought you here today?" the doctor questioned. Then Luffy began to float, but Katakuri sat on the bed and plopped him down to his lap, holding his shoulders so he wouldn't raise off the bed again. "I was jumping on the trampoline and then started to float. But I don't have a quirk," Luffy said loudly, like it was the craziest thing ever, though he didn't sound too bothered. "Papa made sure I didn't float away, though. That would be scary." "When were you declared quirkless?" "He was 4 and 4 months. That was before he contracted vampirism." Of course the doctor had noticed that, so was unsurprised. Since then, he's shown the usual vampire traits. Enhanced senses, speed and strength. Other than that, he's been quirkless up until now. "Then, why don't we take another look at your toe, just in case?" The machine was brought in, and Luffy's foot was x-rayed. Not long later, the image came up, but his pinky toe still had 2 joints. So the original diagnosis hadn't been wrong, and Luffy's feet hadn't changed shape. So this left little evidence that a quirk had suddenly manifested. Well, since it still isn't a quirk he developed, is there a way this is someone else's quirk that has been used on him? "Do you go to school, Luffy?" He nodded, but Katakuri gave the list of known quirks in their class. Preschool and kindergarten had the children in the class's quirks given to every parent in case something like that happened. Perhaps a child accidentally activated their quirk and it was used on another student. But nobody in Luffy's class had a known quirk to make others float. Then it's possible it has to do with your vampire DNA. There have been cases of vampires growing more secondary abilities. But they're very rare and usually only seen in first-generation vampires, purebloods. That's not to say new things aren't being learned about vampires every year. Is there anything else special about Luffy's vampire situation? He has a bond with a werewolf, but his quirk isn't to float, either, Katakuri answered honestly. Well, we should do a few tests. But how about after some food? Even I can hear that hungry tummy rumbling, Dr. Potson said. Luffy was indeed hungry, and so they were led off to the cafeteria. Katakuri walked with Luffy, who wasn't floating at the moment, and wanted to explore. But he was good and didn't run off. When they got food, it was mostly unhealthy options until they went to the specifically healthy food. Luffy got a fancy sandwich and an apple and some peanut butter. Katakuri got the same, only the sandwich was a bigger size. Looking around, there were some quite interesting looking people. At one table there was someone who had various flowers all over their body. Some sprouted and some not. Some were dead, too. It looked like Luffy did not like that one, and looked much happier after that patient left. Katakuri's attention was brought to the child with the furry red arm he'd seen in the lobby. He ran over, and glared at Luffy and Katakuri. Surprisingly, Luffy didn't acknowledge the boy, and liked the peanut butter out of the small bowl. "Where are your parents?" It was nighttime and this kid was wandering around. He gasped. "You can see me," he exclaimed. Luffy looked confused, wondering what Katakuri was talking about. So, Katakuri was either hallucinating or this child had turned invisible and intangible. "Tell them to help me. How about you give me your number and I can call someone for you?" Katakuri offered. Luffy started to float out of his chair. The father didn't want to deal with another kid's issues, but he had to help this boy. So he stuck Luffy to the bench he was sitting on with Mochi, and then called the number that the boy helpfully remembered. "Hello. Your missing child, Ground, is at the Nagakisa Quirk Hospital. He'd like you to come get him." There was some screaming on the other end, and the sounds of car doors slamming shut. Sobs as they were clearly booking it to get there. Ground was crying and happy, thanking Katakuri, who was glad he wasn't hallucinating. But he wondered why it was only him who could sense him in any way. "Papa, I'm bored," Luffy said, picking his nose. "Do you have an imaginary friend? It's a boy you can't see." "Well, it's time to go back. Are you done with the apple? I don't like that spot. It's purple. Purple isn't a good color today." So Katakuri took their trash to the can and put the tray and silverware down. He turned around to see Ground smack the small boy across the face, which hit and made Luffy start crying. Katakuri demanded to know why he hit Luffy, no longer patient and understanding. Ground just glared at him and ran from the room. "A ghost hit me," Luffy screamed. Katakuri picked him up. "Don't worry, I won't let any ghost hurt you. Let's go back to the room, now." Well, now he wasn't in the mood to help that ungrateful child anymore. He knew he should be subjective, as he didn't know anything about the other kid or why he would do that, but Luffy was his son and he was hit, so he was allowed to be sour or irate with Ground. Katakuri went back to the room with Luffy, who moved on quickly, believing his papa wouldn't ever let a ghost hurt him. How dare he hit his child? At least Luffy didn't dwell on it. When they got back to the room, Luffy went under the covers. There are no ghosts around. It had been a boy with a quirk that made it so nobody could see him. "And I'm not gonna let him hurt you. Promise. I promise. K." The doctor came in soon, and Luffy gave some blood draws, not bothered with seeing blood, obviously. And he healed from the needles almost immediately. For being his age and how he used to hate going to the doctors, he behaved perfectly and with a smile. But then he started to get sleepy. It was a long day, and he was tired. When he started to grow a bit grumpy, which only happened when he was sleepy, Katakuri suggested they call it a night. "Sounds like a plan," Dr. Potson said brightly, responding to the situation well. To press Luffy would only cause more trouble. So it was time for bed. Katakuri hadn't actually thought about the fact that he'd be staying, too. Well, the bed was more than big enough, and he had been wearing leisure clothing, too. Luffy changed into pajamas, and got under the covers. "Where's Papa sleeping? This bed is much too big for only you," Katakuri said lightly. "No, I want it all," Luffy said with a smile. "Too bad. Sharing is caring, right? Shishishi. No ghosts, okay." Katakuri promised there would be no ghosts, and had him brush his teeth with the one provided for each of them. Then Luffy went to sleep quickly, and Katakuri hoped things would get better and not worse. Ow! Luffy shouted when something hard hit his leg. He woke up with a start, and crawled away from that side of the bed, screaming in his papa's ear about another ghost. He was scared and couldn't tell where the bad guy was. Katakuri jerked awake, and Luffy watched as he glared and stood up tall. "Do not touch my son. Get out of our room, now," he bellowed. Luffy never saw his papa this angry, and he walked to the door and slammed it shut before locking it. Whatever had done it had left a scratch on Luffy's face. It didn't feel like it was healing, and he cried about it. A nurse hurried in through the other door, looking baffled and surprised by the noise. "What happened, sir?" "Someone came in the room and attacked my child." "Did no parents come for a kid that can't be seen?" She shook her head, seeming confused. "It's not my problem," he said sourly, and went to clean the cut on Luffy's cheek that wasn't healing, right under his left eye. He went to the attached bathroom and got some disinfectant and put a bandage over the cut. Luffy was inconsolable about something he couldn't see that hurt him. "I'll stay awake. He won't hurt you again." Luffy was still uneasy and scared, and couldn't fall back asleep. So he only got 7 hours of sleep and would need more naps. He eventually gave up on sleeping and Katakuri put on a documentary about birds on his phone to pass time, hoping Luffy would fall back asleep, but he didn't. But he wasn't floating anymore. And when he did want to float, and jumped up, nothing happened. "I'm not floating, Papa." "That's good, but we still have to stay longer to see what caused it." Luffy nodded. He wanted to go home, where he didn't think any ghosts would get him. But he was nervous in the room, so Katakuri picked him up, and they walked around the ward a bit. Didn't disturb anyone or anything, but it did help Luffy, not feeling trapped in that room. While they were walking back to the room, Luffy told his papa to stop, because he saw something shimmery in the air. Where? Luffy pointed to their side, and was glad Katakuri saw it too. There were 2 shimmery balls of light, and Luffy was transfixed. It was pretty. His dad looked stunned too. Then, there was a bright flash and then the glowing balls were glowing fish. In the air, the fish swam around. Katakuri reached out to touch one, and it went through his skin before it approached Luffy, and the fish gave him a kiss. And he felt it didn't go through his skin. Ahaha, it touched me, Luffy squealed. Shish, it's late right now. Inside whispers. It touched me, he whispered. Katakuri hid his worried look, and lightly asked Luffy if he could tell them what to do. I want to know if they'll listen to you. Luffy asked them to swim around their heads. They did so. Wow, were they listening to Luffy? Papa, do I have a quirk now? Luffy asked. Well, hopefully we'll find out soon, Katakuri said, Luffy missing the worried hitch in his words. The fishies disappeared, and Luffy was unable to bring them back, but was able to fall asleep again, forgetting all about the scary thing that hit him and he couldn't see. Chapter 10, Unwelcome. Katakuri got out of the car, tired. They'd been at the hospital all day as they floundered at the sheer amount of weird things that had happened to Luffy. First was the floating, and then the fish. After that, Katakuri had been keeping track of every strange thing that happened. The wallpaper color changed in the whole room, Luffy's fingernails turned a shimmery blue, his left earlobe elongated a bit before going back. After that, a massive bubble enveloped the bed and caused a mess. It was just one thing after another, but it turned very problematic when Luffy attempted to attack the doctor when he found there was no blood in the room for him. The strange incidents were caused by Luffy, but doing too many caused him to get painfully thirsty and desperate for blood. He was no longer welcome at that quirk hospital, even if he'd not intended to cause harm. But he was sleeping now, and Katakuri was emotionally exhausted by the day and previous night. All they found out was that Luffy could do a lot of random things, but that there was a price to pay. Too much, and he was depleted of his blood source. It turned dangerous. Hopefully he didn't remember that bit. When they got inside, Luffy under a blanket since they had forgotten sunscreen the night before, he put the boy on the couch and went to get a couple bottles of blood. Luffy woke when the lid was popped off, and he smelled the liquid. Thirsty, he said in a sleepy voice. Katakuri handed him the bottle, and he drank it greedily. How do you feel? I don't wanna do that again, Luffy mumbled. Damn, he remembered. I'm sorry. I was thinking you could draw them a picture with an apology letter. I'll help, too, Katakuri replied kindly, sounding understanding. And Zoro has been calling since 4:30. Luffy said he wanted to talk to Zoro, and so Katakuri gave him the phone. He wished he had 2 phones so he could have his while Luffy could speak to Zoro. But Luffy was only 5, Katakuri wasn't going to buy him his own phone like some parents did. Katakuri came from nothing, there was no way he'd let his kid grow up that way, too, but he'd not let Luffy be spoiled with anything but affection. Katakuri took their dirty clothes to the hamper and started the load of laundry he'd planned the day before but hadn't been able to do once Luffy started to float. There was no game plan on what to do right now, but he knew Luffy wasn't going to go wild with all of these new, various and unpredictable powers. He never wanted to lose control, and would rather be quirkless than have what happened happen again. The only reason nobody had been hurt was because Katakuri had been there. Well, another problem to deal with. He wouldn't be going to school the rest of the week. So he had 3 weeks of school left before the year was over. Barely any time to get to be a kindergartner. Katakuri was just thankful that the teacher thought he'd done well with his homeschooling to prepare him education-wise. After a while of speaking with Zoro, Luffy brought back the phone. He was teary. How's Zoro? ... He's still my friend. Oh, were you worried he wouldn't be? Katakuri asked sadly, crouching to be level with the poor boy. Luffy nodded, tears down his cheeks. I hate being a vampire. He cried, for the first time saying that. At least, the first time he'd said it to Katakuri. He hugged him, rubbing his back. Wanna be better. You'll have vampirism the rest of your life. But that doesn't mean it will be terrible. Smoker, remember him. He must have had a tough time, too, right? But now he's a police officer, putting others above himself and being safe and reliable enough to be trusted by everyone. Being a vampire doesn't make you a monster, he said in a kind, slightly firm voice. Luffy nodded. It'll be trial and error a bit. But you have the summer break coming up soon to have time to get a lot of practice and control. He nodded again, calming down more before he fell asleep, exhausted emotionally. Katakuri brought his poor boy to bed, sad but believing in his determination and mental strength. He had no doubt Luffy could live happily and manage, if not conquer, the issues that were to no doubt come. My daddy told me to stay away from you, Toma said to Luffy one day when he was on the swings. Zoro was napping against the wall. He started to get sleepy a lot and took naps in strange places. Even when he was at Luffy's house, sometimes he just went and took a nap for a couple minutes. Luffy frowned, but said nothing. I saw a video of you attacking a bunch of hospital workers. Luffy looked ashamed, unable to hide the reaction. It was you, then. You're a monster. He cried, and ran off to spread the news. Belmere wasn't fast enough to stop him, and soon he was no longer respected by anybody in the class. They feared him. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. Luffy insisted. Zoro felt his feelings and woke up, hurrying over. That means you can't control yourself, then. It was only that one time. He felt terrible about it. Zoro hugged him, the smaller boy facing away from the crowd of kids who hated and were scared of him. He glared at them all while Luffy cried. His emotions boiled over like they had when his home was destroyed by the floor, and the sun started to burn him, even if it wasn't noon yet. He sprinted inside, the burns on his forehead and shoulders pretty bad. Bad enough for him to need to go to the nurses, even if they'd heal on their own eventually. Luffy was crying the whole way he was escorted to the health office. They were away from the sun inside the campus, and Luffy had bandages and burn cream put on before he had to call his papa to come get him. Luffy was very upset on the phone over how everyone hated him, now. He felt anger through the bond while he spoke to Katakuri on the phone. At the moment, he was at the bank, so Oven said he could bring him home and stay with him until Katakuri got back. He regret being unable to pick him up himself. The cop car was still outside. Mama hadn't shown her face, and they were considering stopping the escort, but the department had become fond of Luffy and weren't annoyed with the protection order. Smoker went there, even if he didn't interact with Luffy personally. The helper lady brought Luffy the umbrella and his things and he went outside when Oven pulled up. He had a spare car seat with him, so Luffy was clipped inside, and when the car started, and their guard followed, Luffy started to cry. Don't worry, you'll be in a new class soon. Those people won't know you, Oven said nicely. Luffy said he wanted to just act normal. You'll get there, don't worry. Things could be hard for a bit, but you'll get there. You have lots of your life to improve, right? Luffy wanted to get better sooner. He didn't want to wait and have hard times. Oven offered to get him a smoothie, and Luffy was all for it. So they went and got food. The back windows had screens over them so the light didn't bother Luffy. In his papa's car, the windows were all tinted dark to keep more sunlight out. They got a smoothie, and then Luffy noticed a car following them a long time. Uncle Oven, a car is following us. You mean the cops? No, a car with a big person inside. Right there, Luffy said, but Oven didn't see him point so he had no idea where. Then the car pulled up beside them, and Oven's eyes popped and he saw the bad woman there. But then the cop car pulled around the corner, finally catching up. The siren went on, and Luffy was scared. It was a car chase, now. And Oven had to speed up on the freeway once the bad woman's car started tailgating them. Luffy was scared when the car bumped into their bumper, moving them forward and making them swerve a bit. More cop cars started chasing, and Oven was swearing profuse as he tried to pull into another lane, but was unable to without risking a worse hit. The cops were shouting at her to pull over or they'd shoot her tires. But Oven hated that because she could go out of control and hit them. Luffy was screaming and crying, but Uncle wasn't paying attention to the vampire boy's panic. The car was shoved forward more, and Luffy wanted to do something to help. He thought of any power to help, and he imagined the fishies, only that didn't work, and all of Mama's tires burst, and the car ran into an invisible wall, crunching it to pieces with her inside. Oven pulled over a bit away, breathing rapidly. But now that it started, more powers started to come. Blood. Uncle, my blood baggies. Luffy screeched, not wanting to lose control. Oven hurried to the bags and got out the single undrunken bottle and handed it to Luffy, who was breathing rapidly. He grabbed the blood roughly, spilling some on his hand as he chugged it down, eyes scrunched closed. It wasn't enough, and he started to growl and try to get out of the car seat. Oven put Katakuri on video call, and got the issue quickly when he saw Luffy writhing and thrashing around in his car seat, very out of it that he couldn't easily clip himself out. Luffy, you're safe, calm down. You got some blood, shish, you're okay. Calm, breath in and out. Yes, slowly, in and out. He calmed down Luffy, who then fell asleep, exhausted. The uncle was sweating profusely and shaking a bit from the ordeal. A police car pulled up next to them, asking if they were alright. Luffy was asleep, thankfully. Katakuri was leaving the bank immediately to come get his son. The car was unable to be driven, the tires messed up, so they moved Luffy into the back of the police car, and Oven sat next to him. They drove to the nearest station, and Mama was being pulled out of the wreck, covered in blood but alive and heavily restrained. Oven took Luffy's small, sweaty hand, feeling bad but grateful to the boy for whatever he'd done to help. Katakuri slammed the station doors open and ran down the hall to his son, who was sleepy but not asleep. He had a sandwich in front of him and a bottle of half-empty blood. When Luffy sensed and saw his father, he dropped out of the chair and ran to him, hugging his legs before Katakuri crouched down to hug him tightly. Oven had explained what happened over the phone. What happened after Luffy stopped Mama's car. She was in custody now, so she wouldn't be causing any more problems. There were extremely strong heroes dealing with her, as word of her spread around the law enforcement and hero community. She was a big threat they wanted under control immediately. You did good, Luffy, Katakuri praised kindly. Luffy sniffled and nodded, wiping his face. What a terrible day it had been for him. Hopefully things were better feeling now that the threat was gone. Maybe now they didn't need to be followed and escorted everywhere. Not that it had been a major inconvenience or anything. They were only there a bit before Luffy could leave, already having given his story of what happened. The police were more than kind and understanding about Luffy's craving, and got him more blood in case anything else happened. It was nice they were not judgmental or scared of him after what had gone on. He took Luffy straight home and Oven went to try and get his car fixed since he had a business trip the next day and needed his car. When they got home, Luffy went to his playroom with Katakuri's phone to call Zoro, who must have been panicked. He had been unable to reach Luffy from school, but he had to have felt the intense emotion that Luffy felt. Thank God she was caught, and all of the siblings were informed after dinner that she was going back behind the slammer in a more high-security prison. This time, in Japan since in another country, it had been corrupted and the family had not been told. The prison that covered it up were being sanctioned and possibly shut down. Katakuri felt no remorse for them. Luffy was at a play date with Zoro when his random, unpredictable abilities started to go out of control. They were in the pool, and Luffy lost control in panic and turned to Zoro, bloodthirsty, eyes wide. Zoro seemed scared, but Luffy didn't attack. Even if he felt that frenzied state, panicked for blood as all of it was used up as his powers went out of control fast due to panic, but he did not attack Zoro. Had no drive to do so. Zoro slowly walked around his rabid-looking best friend Vampire, and went inside to get him some blood they had in a fridge in the garage. He brought it back cautiously, and Luffy slurped it down, eyes losing the crazed look. The werewolf was smiling smugly. Coming back to himself, Luffy was confused that he hadn't attacked the nearest source of blood. There's no way you'd hurt me. I trust you completely, now. I never distrusted you, but I'm confident you'll never hurt me, Zoro said with a smile, looking proud and impressed. Luffy's mouth wobbled a bit before he smiled, so happy he hadn't attacked him even when painfully thirsty. Zoro walked forward and hugged him, and Luffy hugged him back. He loved Zoro, he was the best. I'm going to talk to Mama, Perospero said at the coffee shop with Katakuri. Mama was in prison and was being interviewed. The children could speak with her if they'd like. What will you do? I'm better off not speaking to that monster ever again. I have no interest in speaking to someone like that. I just want to move on and help Luffy forget about it, the father replied, taking a sip of his coffee. His brother seemed unsurprised. An air of calm had overcome all the siblings and their spouses, with her finally being caught. Oven was the most furious at her trying to run him off the road, with Luffy inside. It was bad enough to do it to him in the first place, but to do it with his little nephew in the car made him even more livid. But he wasn't going to see her, either. Knowing chewing her out would do nothing but frustrate him. So why do such a thing? Katakuri was still shaken by it, but Luffy did his best to move on, even if he was ostracized and feared completely in his class. It didn't help he and Zoro had been caught sharing blood while waiting for their parents to come. Kappa reported them about it and the boys had been asked what on earth they were thinking. When Luffy shared the situation, the teacher looked confused, and called both parents, thinking they hadn't known. It was lucky there was 1 week of school left, because the vampire and werewolf pair would be going to another school for first grade. Katakuri and Kushiro had been annoyed they did it at school, but Luffy was stressed and embarrassed. When the teachers gave both of them red slips, they agreed to never do it at school again. Though Katakuri doubted they would be able to keep that promise. They were young and impulsive. They were bound to mess up again. It was just lucky CPS wasn't called on them or something about it. It was something nobody knew about, so it was shocking and maybe concerning. With all parties unbothered by it, there wasn't much they should and could do. But it only made them more ostracized and rejected. Zoro went off on all of them, saying it was normal and they should all shut their pee-holes. After that, he got a timeout. The last week of school went horrible, and Luffy hated it. He was just glad it was the end. Katakuri was, too. Right now, Luffy was at Pudding's house, who was baking him banana bread that the boy had been craving and whining about all day. There was no reason not to get him some when he didn't throw a tantrum about it or anything. Tell me what she says to you as long as it has nothing to do with Luffy. I don't want to feel angry anymore, Katakuri said, leaning forward in the nicely sized chair. Both of them were tall but fit comfortably. While they were leaving, Katakuri stayed at seeing Ben there. He went to speak to him, and they sat back down, Katakuri with a water, now. Ben wanted to hear about Luffy, so Katakuri gave him the truth. Well, for someone his age, he's done well to adapt, even as problems come up. I'm surprised about what happened with Zoro, though. I suppose we should have known something like that. Now we know. He sounded regretful. Don't worry, it seemed neither of them is bothered by it. Luffy is in control when he's around Zoro. I doubt he'd ever harm him, Katakuri said with confidence. I am sure he'd like to talk with you again. Is there any chance I can get your phone number? Absolutely, I rarely get updates on former patients, Ben said brightly. They exchanged numbers, and the father was glad he had some good news to give his baby. They both left, and Katakuri headed home and waited for Pudding to call him over to pick the boy up. When he did, Luffy was ecstatic to hear in the car that his helper would want to speak with him again. When they got home, he wanted to call him, but Katakuri reminded him that Ben would call when he was available. He's a busy man, helping little boys and girls in yours and Zoro's situation. Okay, Luffy moped a bit, wanting to talk soon. But then he went to jump on the trampoline for a while, and was successfully distracted. Luffy screamed and cried at his blood bottles on the ground. Someone took them from his cubby and dumped them outside. Now he didn't have any, and he was not allowed to drink from Zoro. The teacher was furious and demanded to know who had done it. The kids all denied until it was found out it was a girl from the other kindergarten class. When the classes were mingling for the last day of school, they went to Luffy's cubby and took them away. But this was dangerous. Luffy needed blood often or he'd grow upset, and the kids thought him being upset was putting them in danger. Luffy only got uncomfortable unless he missed blood for at least 12 hours. Zoro offered him some, but the teacher shot that down, and one of the nurses left the school to fetch a few blood bottles for Luffy for the last 2 hours of his time in kindergarten. He had so many things he wanted to do differently at his next class in the next school. The girl's name was Ulti, and she had a mask on, but her smirk was obvious. Even as she was sent home, she gave Luffy a nasty, rude look. He sniffled at the treatment, and went to the corner of the room for the following 2 hours, having no reason to interact with everyone who was cruel to him and Zoro. Him especially, and they were all scared to talk or anger him. It hurt. He felt terrible there, and wanted to start over already. Zoro stuck with him and would bring him the lemon cupcakes. Luffy refused, not wanting to eat sugar. So Zoro brought him the strawberries, feeling for his best friend. They both knew the bad feelings very well. When the class was over, Luffy said goodbye to nobody, and made no eye contact. He just went out under the umbrella and straight to the car. Zoro was coming too, and both boys were silent in the car. Papa, am I a good boy? Luffy asked while music quietly played from the radio. Of course, there are issues you have with control, but you're a very good boy, Katakuri said sincerely. Luffy just nodded once, and looked out the tinted windows with a blank look. Zoro took his hand and squeezed it. His friend squeezed it back, but did not look away from the window at the other cars. All summer, Luffy was wholly uninterested in trying to master his powers, which made no sense as nothing was consistent with them. He didn't want them at all, and resisted ever using them. No matter if Katakuri encouraged him to try, Luffy refused, never wanted to attack people again. So he wasn't training control, but training himself to resist. For weeks, he was successful. Katakuri had a feeling that he knew he couldn't just keep switching schools if things went wrong, so he was trying to make sure nothing went wrong. Katakuri and Kushiro agreed on what school to place them in. It was a school for children whose quirks were failing them. They also were known to accept vampires and werewolf children, rare though they may be. The teacher and principal were prematurely alerted to Zoro and Luffy's bond, which they were prepared for. Katakuri had some faith it would be the right place for the both of them. Even if there were mean children, the school seemed like it would have their backs.